I remember the moment I decided to go to the cabin. I had been working non-stop for months, the stress piling on like a weight I couldn't shake. And when I found a small, secluded cabin tucked deep in the mountains online, it seemed like a perfect escape. The pictures showed a rustic wooden building, old but sturdy, surrounded by thick forest, with a small creek running alongside it. The thought of being alone, away from people, away from the constant noise and deadlines, felt like the kind of peace I hadn't known in years. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I just packed my car with food, water, blankets, a first aid kit, a flashlight, batteries, and a small emergency tool set, and I left. The drive was long, winding through narrow mountain roads with dense trees pressing close on both sides. The sun was starting to set when I finally turned onto a barely visible dirt path that led toward the cabin. Every twist of the road made my stomach tighten, but I told myself it was just excitement, anticipation, the rush of being somewhere completely alone. When I arrived, the cabin was exactly as it had appeared in the pictures. Its wooden frame had weathered to a dull gray, the roof sagged slightly, and moss clung to the walls in damp patches. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney, even though it was supposed to be empty. I shook off the uneasy feeling that settled in the pit of my stomach and parked the car in the small clearing in front of the cabin. I unloaded my things, dragging boxes and bags across the uneven ground, my boots sinking slightly into the soft soil. The forest was quiet, too quiet, the only sound the occasional creak of the cabin and the distant rush of the creek. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of damp wood and old pine. Dust lay thick in corners, and a few cobwebs hung in the shadows. I opened the windows, letting the cool mountain air drift in, and set down my things. The furniture was minimal: one bed, a small wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a stove in the corner. There was a small supply of firewood stacked near the wall. I started a fire in the stove to warm the place, the flame crackling and sending long shadows across the walls. I unpacked my things slowly, trying to enjoy the solitude. For the first few hours, the quiet was soothing. I moved around the cabin, organizing, cleaning a little, and watching as the sun dipped behind the trees. The sky turned a deep orange and then a dark purple. The forest outside the windows looked thick and impenetrable, almost alive in the fading light. Night came, and with it, a feeling I couldn't shake. It wasn't fear at first, just a low, gnawing awareness that the world outside the cabin was vast and unknown. I could hear the creek more clearly now, and the wind moving through the trees sounded like 1,000 whispers. I told myself it was nothing. Animals, maybe the wind, my imagination exaggerating. I made a simple meal, eating in silence, and then settled near the fire, reading an old book I had brought. Every now and then, a branch would tap against the window, or a small thump would echo from somewhere outside, and my heart would jump. Around midnight, the noises started. At first, it was just a small scratching, faint but distinct, coming from outside the cabin. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The scratching continued, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. I told myself it was a raccoon or some other small animal. I got up, flashlight in hand, and checked the perimeter of the cabin. The forest was dark, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the blackness, revealing nothing but trees, rocks, and the occasional rustle of leaves. I walked the edges carefully, every step making the ground crunch beneath my boots, but I saw nothing. I went back inside, trying to calm myself. Maybe the sound had been nothing after all. But it didn't stop. The scratching returned, louder now and closer, as if whatever it was had moved right up to the cabin walls. My stomach knotted, and my pulse quickened. I checked the doors and windows, making sure they were all locked. I pushed heavy furniture against the main door just in case. I sat down, trying to focus on breathing, but my eyes kept darting toward the windows. The wind picked up outside, rattling the glass and making the shadows flicker across the walls. I could hear something moving, heavy, deliberate steps circling the cabin. My mind refused to let me rationalize it. This wasn't just an animal. Animals didn't move like that, not with such weight, not with such purpose. I decided to stay awake, pacing back and forth, flashlight and small knife in hand. Every sound made my heart pound harder. I heard a branch snap under something heavy, then silence, then scratching again. I considered leaving the cabin immediately, driving down the mountain road, but the thought of stepping into that dark forest outside made my stomach twist. The path to the car was long, uneven, and treacherous. I realized I wasn't prepared to run through that forest in the dark. I had to wait until daylight. Hours passed like minutes. I stayed near the fire, moving as little as possible, my senses straining for every sound. The scratching stopped at times, then returned. Occasionally, I would hear a low, deliberate thump on the roof. My mind raced through every possibility, every scenario that could explain it. It had to be a human, I told myself. No animal made footsteps like that on a roof. I thought about the news stories I had read about isolated cabins and crimes in remote areas. My hands shook as I checked the windows again. The forest seemed alive, the darkness pressing against the glass. I could hear my own heartbeat in the quiet moments, loud and unrelenting. As dawn began to break, the first pale light filtering through the trees, I finally allowed myself a small sense of relief. The noises stopped. The heavy presence seemed to vanish with the darkness. I cautiously opened the door and stepped outside, the morning air crisp and cool. The forest looked peaceful, almost serene. But as I circled the cabin, I noticed signs of intrusion. The dirt near one of the side windows was disturbed, small footprints pressed into the soil. The wood of the window frame had scratch marks, long and deep, as if someone or something had tried to pry it open. My stomach sank, and a chill ran through me despite the rising sun. I realized I had not been imagining the threat. Someone had been here. I decided to leave immediately. I packed the car in record time, my hands shaking, my eyes constantly scanning the forest. I took the main dirt path down the mountain slowly, the car tires crunching over loose stones. I didn't look back until I reached the main road, paved and familiar. Relief flooded me as I drove away, the trees thinning, the forest retreating. When I finally stopped at a gas station, I realized the full extent of what had happened. My hands were cut and scratched from checking the windows and carrying my things. My clothes were torn and dirt-stained. My mind was exhausted, replaying every sound, every shadow from the cabin. I told myself I had escaped without physical harm, but the psychological toll was immense. I realized how vulnerable I had been, alone and isolated in a place I thought was safe. In the following days, I reported the incident to the local authorities. They investigated the cabin, and it turned out that a transient man had been living in the forest nearby, hiding from law enforcement. He had broken into the cabin multiple times, watching and waiting. The authorities found evidence of his presence: makeshift shelters, scattered belongings, and signs of habitation in the surrounding woods. Knowing this, I understood that the fear I felt was real, grounded in actual danger. The knowledge brought a strange sense of closure, but also a lingering unease. I realized how quickly solitude could turn into vulnerability, how thin the line was between peace and fear in the wilderness. I never returned to that cabin. I never went back to the mountains alone, but the experience stayed with me, the memory of those long hours of darkness, the weight of unseen eyes, the sound of deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. I learned to respect isolation, to prepare, to never assume safety in unfamiliar terrain. I bought a small property closer to civilization for future escapes, a place where I could enjoy solitude without risking my life. That experience changed the way I approached the world. I became more cautious, more aware of surroundings, more thoughtful about decisions. I kept my tools ready, my phone charged, and I learned to trust instincts that I might once have ignored. The fear I felt in that cabin was not abstract. It was real, tangible, and it taught me lessons I would carry forever. I survived because I stayed calm, because I paid attention, because I understood the danger and acted. That knowledge, that hard-earned understanding, became my shield, a constant reminder that survival is often about awareness, preparedness, and the willingness to move carefully, even when fear grips you. Even now, years later, when I walk through a quiet forest or see a cabin in the mountains, I feel a shiver. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. My life had grown monotonous, filled with the relentless demands of work, the constant drone of city noise, and the emptiness of a routine that had begun to feel more like a trap than a life. I wanted something different, a pause, a moment away from everything I knew. The cabin was supposed to be my escape. I found it online, a small, rustic cabin in the dense woods of a national forest several hours away from the nearest town. The photos were inviting. Weathered with siding, a steeply pitched roof, smoke curling from a chimney, and a porch that overlooked a clearing surrounded by thick pines. Felt like the promise of solitude. The drive there was long and quiet. I left before dawn, the sky barely lightening, the roads empty except for the occasional truck or deer crossing the lanes. The air in the car was stale, and I could feel tension in my shoulders even as I listened to the faint hum of the engine. I had packed minimally: clothes, food, water, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit. I told myself I would keep it simple. Part of me feared I might get bored alone, but another part welcomed the silence. When I finally arrived, the cabin was even more isolated than I had imagined. The narrow dirt road had ended abruptly, giving way to a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. The cabin looked unchanged from the photos. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, a scent I hadn't realized I missed so deeply. The sun was still low, casting long shadows across the clearing, making the woods look almost menacing. The quiet was profound. No cars, no distant chatter, just the occasional sound of a bird or the rustle of leaves in the wind. I spent the first hour unloading supplies and inspecting the cabin. It was simple but functional. The interior was modest, with a small kitchen area, a table, a wood-burning stove, and a single bedroom loft. The windows were large enough to let in sunlight, but the glass was slightly grimy, giving the room a muted, filtered light. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I could see tiny gaps in the wood where insects had found their way inside over the years. The walls were thick, darkened with age, but I could feel the solidness of the structure. I liked that. I wanted it to feel like a shelter. As I unpacked, I noticed the faint smell of dampness, a mix of old wood and mildew. It wasn't unpleasant, but it reminded me that the cabin had been empty for some time. I cleaned surfaces, set my things down, and built a small fire in the stove to chase away the evening chill. The crackle of the wood was comforting, a sound that felt alive in the stillness. Outside, the forest grew darker as the sun sank behind the trees. Shadows stretched and the air grew colder. Night came quickly. I ate a simple meal of canned soup and bread, washing it down with water I had boiled over the stove. The darkness pressed against the windows, the forest beyond the clearing now a nearly solid wall of black. I sat on the floor near the stove, my back against the wall, listening. The wind rustled the branches above, and occasionally, a small animal would scurry through the underbrush. The isolation was both soothing and slightly unnerving. There was no one around for miles, and the thought of that fact alone made me aware of my vulnerability. It was around 10 o'clock when I first heard it, a soft, rhythmic noise outside, like the crunch of boots on gravel or dry leaves. At first, I thought it might be a deer or perhaps some small animal, but the steps were deliberate, slow, and too heavy to be anything natural. My heart began to beat faster. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it out the window, sweeping the beam across the clearing. Nothing. The shadows of the trees swayed in the wind, but there was no sign of movement. I told myself it was my imagination, that the forest had its own sounds, that I was just on edge. I tried to focus on the fire and the small comforts of the cabin, but the noise continued. Every few minutes, the soft crunch of footsteps returned, always around the edge of the clearing, always in that same slow rhythm. Hours passed, and the footsteps seemed to circle the cabin. I stayed inside, the flashlight held tightly in my hand, the fire low but glowing. Sleep became impossible. I realized I hadn't locked the cabin door, though I had the key in hand. I tried to convince myself I was safe, that whoever or whatever was out there would not approach. But the idea of someone circling my cabin, hidden in the dark, filling the air with the sound of deliberate movement, gnawed at my nerves. By the early hours of the morning, the sound stopped. The forest fell silent again, except for the occasional rustle of leaves. Exhaustion overtook my fear, and I drifted into a fitful sleep near the stove. My dreams were fragmented and anxious, filled with vague images of movement in the dark, shadows at the edge of the clearing. When I awoke, the morning light was bright, almost harsh as it filtered through the dirty windows. I felt stiff and unrefreshed, my mind still haunted by the sounds of the night. The cabin, in the morning, felt less cozy and more exposed. I ate a cold breakfast, trying to shake off the unease, telling myself the forest was quiet and the footsteps had been nothing. Maybe a hiker, maybe an animal, maybe my imagination. But as I cleaned up, I noticed something outside the cabin. A single footprint in the dirt near the door. It was human, large, and unmistakable. My stomach sank. Whoever had been circling the cabin had left this behind. Panic set in and I began to plan. I considered leaving immediately, but the nearest road was a mile down the narrow dirt track, and I had no cell service to call for help. The thought of walking through the forest alone, with whoever had been outside possibly still nearby, was terrifying. I decided to stay inside, to fortify the cabin, and wait until I could see the road and flag down a passing car. I spent the day boarding up the windows as best I could with spare wood I found in the cabin. I moved the furniture near the doors, creating barriers. I checked the stove, prepared extra firewood, and made sure I had a clear path to the door in case I had to escape. Every sound outside, every snap of a branch, made me flinch. I barely ate, drinking water in sips to keep my stomach settled. The sun moved slowly across the sky, but each hour felt like a test of endurance. Night came again. This time, I did not hear footsteps immediately, but I was hyper-aware of every noise. The wind, the animals, even the trees creaking in the darkness felt menacing. I stayed awake all night, flashlight in hand, sitting close to the door. My body ached. My eyes stung from lack of sleep, but the fear kept me alert. The next morning, I saw more footprints outside, leading around the cabin, then stopping abruptly at the treeline. Someone had been out there, watching, waiting. I realized I needed to get out to reach civilization, but I had to be careful. I prepared my bag quickly, taking only what was essential: water, some food, the flashlight, and a small folding knife I kept for emergencies. I waited until midday, when the sun was high, hoping that whoever had been circling the cabin would be gone. I left through the back door, moving quickly but quietly through the forest. I tried to stay in the shadows of trees, avoiding open areas. My heart raced, and I kept glancing behind me, half expecting someone to appear. The dirt road appeared after about half an hour, and I moved toward it, hoping for a passing vehicle. I walked for what felt like hours under the oppressive heat of the midday sun, stopping only to rest in shaded areas. Finally, a truck appeared in the distance. I waved frantically, my voice hoarse from shouting. The driver slowed, rolled down the window, and I explained my situation in short, urgent sentences. He didn't hesitate, letting me climb into the cab. Relief washed over me as we drove toward the nearest town, the safety of other people, and the knowledge that I had escaped. Back in town, I reported the situation to the local authorities. They were skeptical at first but took my report seriously. A small investigation found footprints around the cabin consistent with someone scouting the area, though no one was caught. I realized later that my fear, my isolation, and the unknown motives of this person had made the experience far more terrifying than I had anticipated. In the days that followed, I processed what had happened. The fear had left me shaken, but it also left me with a sense of survival, a reminder of the fragility of solitude. I learned to respect isolation in a way I never had before, to be cautious and prepared, and to understand that danger could come from other humans just as much as it could from the natural world. Looking back, the cabin trip had given me what I initially sought: solitude, a break from the city, but at a cost. I had discovered a vulnerability I hadn't recognized, a reminder that the world outside civilization could be both beautiful and threatening. I had survived, and that survival brought a strange sense of clarity. I returned to my life in the city with a renewed appreciation for safety, human connection, and the importance. I had been planning this solo cabin trip for months. The idea was simple: escape the city, get away from the constant noise and pressure, and spend a week in the woods just by myself. I found a small cabin online, listed as remote but still accessible by a dirt road. It looked perfect: small, wooden, surrounded by trees, with a tiny stream running nearby. The pictures didn't lie. It was rustic but solid, with a wood stove, a single bed, a small kitchenette, and a loft area I could use for storage. I packed my bag carefully, making sure I had food for the week, plenty of water, batteries, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. I told myself I was prepared for anything. The drive out was longer than I expected. The road narrowed as I drove deeper into the forest, dirt and gravel replacing asphalt, and the trees grew so dense on either side that sunlight barely reached the ground. At first, the isolation felt peaceful. I could hear birds, the wind in the trees, and the faint sound of the stream beside the road. But as the sun began to dip lower, the same isolation started to feel heavy. I checked my phone, no signal. Not surprising, but it gave me a flicker of unease. Still, I rationalized it. I was looking for solitude. I reached the cabin just as the sky turned a dull orange. The cabin itself was smaller than I imagined, but sturdy. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and inside, the air smelled faintly of wood and dust, but not unpleasantly. I set my bag down and started unpacking. I stacked firewood by the stove, laid out my food, checked the windows, and made sure the locks worked. Everything seemed fine. By the time night fell, I had a fire going in the stove. It wasn't cold yet, but the warmth and the flicker of the flames were comforting. I ate a simple meal and then sat by the window, looking out at the forest. Darkness had fully fallen, and the woods seemed almost alive with noise. The rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a branch, the far-off cry of some animal. My own thoughts felt loud in that silence. I reminded myself that I had come here to be alone. The first night passed without incident. I slept in the small bed, the fire still crackling, and the sound of the stream outside was strangely soothing. Morning came with light filtering in through the windows, turning the cabin a warm shade of amber. I made coffee, ate breakfast, and decided to explore the area a little. The forest surrounding the cabin was thick, full of underbrush and fallen logs, and the terrain was uneven. I followed a small path along the stream, noting landmarks I could use to avoid getting lost. Everything seemed normal at first, but over the next couple of days, subtle things started to feel off. I would hear a branch snap or a rustle that seemed too deliberate. I would catch glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, shadows that weren't mine. Sometimes it was animals, probably deer or raccoons, but sometimes it felt different, heavier. Watching, I kept telling myself it was just nerves, the isolation playing tricks on me. On the third day, while chopping wood outside, I noticed footprints. Not human-sized ones, but larger, deeper impressions, like something heavy had walked near the cabin overnight. They weren't fresh, but they were close enough to make me uneasy. I examined the ground carefully. They led from the tree line to the edge of the clearing around the cabin, then disappeared into the forest again. I checked all around the cabin but saw no sign of anyone. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was probably a bear passing through. Bears were common in that area. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every creak, every sound seemed louder, closer. The wind picked up, rustling the trees violently, and I imagined shapes moving in the darkness outside the window. I kept my flashlight by the bed and the door locked. Morning finally came, pale and gray. I forced myself to eat and drink coffee, trying to shake off the tension. On the fourth day, I decided to hike a little further. I wanted to prove to myself that I could manage the isolation and that my nerves weren't getting the best of me. I followed a ridge above the stream, noting landmarks so I could find my way back. Hours passed. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, but the deeper I went, the quieter it became. The usual birdsong faded. Even the wind seemed subdued. My skin prickled. I considered turning back, but I kept going. Eventually, I stumbled onto an old, overgrown logging path. It wasn't on my map, and it looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Curiosity drew me forward. I walked along it, stepping carefully over roots and rocks. The silence was oppressive. I stopped several times, listening. No birds, no insects, not even the faint hum of the stream. Only my own breathing and footsteps. Then I saw it. A figure standing in the distance between the trees. It was a man, tall, wearing dark clothing. He didn't move at first, just stood there. I froze. My mind raced. There were no houses for miles. Who could be here? I considered turning back quietly, but my foot caught on a root, and I stumbled. The man took a step forward. My heart thudded. I turned and ran back down the path as fast as I could. Branches whipped my face and arms. Roots snagged my feet, but I didn't stop. When I finally reached the cabin, I slammed the door behind me and locked it. I checked the windows, every corner of the cabin, but there was no sign of him. For the next 2 days, I stayed inside almost entirely. I didn't chop wood. I barely moved from the fire. Every sound outside made me flinch. I thought about calling someone, but there was no signal. I thought about hiking out, but I didn't know where he had gone or if he was waiting. I realized that what I feared most wasn't being alone. It was someone else being out there in the woods with me, unknown and unpredictable. By the 6th day, my supplies were low. I had to leave eventually. I packed food and water in a small backpack, took my flashlight and a pocket knife, and prepared to hike back to the main road. I left the cabin cautiously, checking behind me constantly. The forest felt different now, darker, heavier, like it was pressing in on me. My pace was fast but careful. I avoided the logging path and stuck to familiar trails. I made it to the dirt road without incident, though my muscles ached and my heart was still racing. A car passed in the distance, and I waved desperately until it stopped. The driver, a local, gave me a startled look, but I managed to explain quickly that I had been staying in a cabin in the woods. He offered to drive me back to town. As we drove, I kept glancing out the window at the trees I had just escaped, wondering about the man I had seen. Back in town, I reported the sighting to the local ranger station. They noted it but said there had been no other reports. I never went back to that cabin. I thought about it often, the quiet, the forest, and the feeling of being watched. I realized that isolation is a strange thing. Alone, you are safe from people, but the unknown can be just as dangerous, and sometimes even more terrifying because you cannot predict it. I never returned to the woods that deep again, and I never forgot the way it felt to be truly alone with someone else's presence just beyond reach. I learned to respect the wilderness, not for its beauty, but for the way it hides what you cannot see, and how quickly comfort can turn into fear. I had been planning this trip for months, the kind of getaway that promised complete isolation. The idea had been simple. A small cabin, miles from the nearest road, tucked deep in the forest, where the air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. I wanted to be completely alone, away from the constant noise and demands of life in the city. I had imagined long hours of reading, occasional walks along narrow dirt trails, and nights sitting by a small fire while the wind whispered through the trees. I had packed carefully, double-checking supplies, making sure I had enough food, water, and fuel, along with all the usual outdoor gear, flashlight, batteries, first aid, and some extra blankets. I thought I was ready. The drive to the cabin was longer than I expected. The paved road eventually gave way to gravel, then dirt, then nothing but ruts and mud patches carved into the side of the mountain. At first, it was exciting, the thrill of being far from civilization. But by the time I turned onto the narrow trail leading directly to the cabin, the thrill had shifted into a kind of tense focus. My car tires sank into loose soil in places, and I had to maneuver carefully around deep puddles and exposed roots. The forest seemed to close in as I drove further. The trees were enormous, their thick trunks forming natural walls along the trail. Every now and then, I saw the outline of a deer or the shadow of a bird, but mostly it was just me and the sound of the engine echoing faintly through the trees. When I finally arrived, The cabin was smaller than I had imagined. A wooden structure with darkened logs and a steep roof covered in moss. There was no power, no running water, only a chimney that suggested a wood stove inside. The place had been abandoned for some time. I could see leaves and debris along the edges of the porch, and the wood smelled faintly of damp decay. I carried my bag inside, relieved to finally step onto a solid floor, but immediately aware of how quiet it was. The forest outside made no sound beyond a distant rustle of leaves, and the silence inside the cabin seemed almost too deep, pressing against my ears. I unpacked slowly, placing food into a small pantry, stacking firewood by the stove, and setting up my sleeping area. Everything was simple, nothing fancy. I made a fire, and the small flames cast long shadows across the walls. As night fell, the isolation hit me fully. There was no light beyond the fire, no hum of electricity, no distant voices. The darkness outside the windows was thick and absolute. I checked my supplies again, and then settled into a chair near the fire with a book. The first night passed quietly, uneventful, the only interruptions being the occasional wind shaking the trees or the distant call of an owl. I slept fitfully, half waking at strange creaks and groans, convincing myself it was just the cabin settling. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The cabin sat near a small clearing that led to trails winding up and down the hillside. The ground was uneven, covered in fallen leaves and tangled roots. I walked for hours, noting the beauty of the forest, the small streams, the moss-covered rocks. But there was also something unnerving about the way the forest seemed to follow me. Every time I stopped, I felt like I was being watched, though I never saw anyone. The feeling was vague at first, easy to dismiss. But as the day went on, I began noticing subtle things. Footprints that weren't mine, broken twigs that suggested movement, and the sense that sounds, small, insignificant noises, were closer than they should be. That night, the feeling worsened. I had built a fire and eaten, and while I tried to read, my attention kept drifting to the windows. Shadows seemed to move differently, almost like they were following the pattern of the trees outside, but shifting just enough that it didn't match reality. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps my eyes were adjusting, or the wind was playing tricks on the branches, but the unease grew heavier. Every creak of the cabin floor sounded deliberate, too precise to be just the wood settling. When I lay down to sleep, I left the fire burning, hoping the light would keep me from overthinking. In the early hours, I woke to a faint sound, a scrape against the cabin wall. At first, I froze, unsure if I had imagined it, but then I heard it again, a slow, dragging noise coming from the back of the cabin. My heart raced. I reached for my flashlight and held it tightly, my hand shaking. I didn't want to step outside, not knowing what was out there, but I couldn't ignore the sound either. I moved carefully toward the back window and shone the beam across the yard. Nothing. The forest was dense and black, nothing visible but shadows. I told myself it was an animal, perhaps a deer or a raccoon, and tried to calm down. Yet the sense of being watched lingered, gnawing at the edges of my nerves. The next morning, I found signs that made the unease worse. Near the edge of the clearing, there were footprints in the soft mud, human footprints, though they weren't mine. They led from the forest toward the cabin, then disappeared near the trees on the far side. My stomach sank. I realized I wasn't as alone as I thought. I spent the day in a mix of anxiety and preparation. I reinforced the door with a heavy log, checked all windows, and kept my firewood close at hand. I stayed inside as much as possible, scanning the perimeter frequently. Every time I looked outside, I half expected to see a shadow vanish among the trees. The following night was the worst. I had tried to convince myself the footprints were old, the sounds coincidental, but around midnight, it became impossible to deny. The scraping began again, louder and more deliberate, followed by a heavy thud against the side of the cabin. I gripped the fire poker I had pulled from the stove and crept toward the door. The door rattled as though someone was testing it. I held my breath, listening. Then came a sharp cracking sound, the porch boards under weight, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving away. I froze, realizing that whoever or whatever had come this close now had retreated. I stayed awake the rest of the night, huddled near the fire, sweating and trembling. Morning brought little relief. The footprints from last night were clear in the mud, closer now than before. They ended abruptly at the tree line, as if whoever made them had vanished into the forest. I realized I couldn't stay here safely much longer. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it someone watching me? A criminal hiding in the woods? Someone using the isolation to stalk? I felt trapped, the forest beautiful yet oppressive, enclosing me from escape. I packed what I could, though I left heavy items in case I had to move quickly. As I prepared to leave, I noticed signs of someone having been inside the cabin while I slept. Small disturbances near the firewood, a faint footprint in dust on the floor, an object slightly moved from where I remembered placing it. Panic surged. I loaded my bag into the car, checked that everything I needed was ready, and started the engine. The road back seemed longer, the forest more suffocating. Every shadow felt like it could hide someone waiting, and I drove with a constant grip on the steering wheel, scanning both sides for movement. The drive down the mountain was tense. I kept thinking I saw figures between the trees, always at the corner of my vision. I imagined them following the road, though the terrain made it impossible to catch up quickly. My mind ran through every scenario, each one worse than the last, until the gravel road finally met the pavement. The relief was immediate, almost shocking, and I allowed myself to exhale fully. I didn't stop at the nearest town. I drove directly to a friend's place, somewhere crowded and full of life, the kind of place where I could feel surrounded by people. I called the local authorities later to report what had happened, describing the cabin and the footprints, and they confirmed that the area had seen incidents before. Hikers and visitors occasionally reported being watched or followed, sometimes even finding evidence of squatters. They promised to patrol the area, though I knew I might never know who had been inside the cabin or why. In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled with lingering unease. I couldn't stop replaying the experience, analyzing each sound, each shadow, each footprint. But with time, the fear eased into caution. I learned to appreciate the city's noise, the presence of other people, and the ordinary, predictable safety of everyday life. I returned to hiking, but never again into isolated cabins deep in the forest. I realized the thrill of solitude was not worth the terror of being truly alone in a place where someone else could be watching, patient and unseen. Eventually, I found balance again, walking trails that were populated, camping sites with other people nearby. The experience left a permanent mark, a reminder that wilderness is beautiful but indifferent, and that isolation can be dangerous when others with unknown intentions are involved. I often think back to that cabin, the stillness of the night, the feeling of being hunted without ever seeing the hunter. It taught me vigilance, the necessity of preparation, and a respect for places where no one is supposed to be, but where someone could still be waiting. Even now, years later, when I walk in the I had been driving for hours. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of black cutting through the thick green of the forests. My plan had been simple: escape the city for a week, somewhere quiet, somewhere I could disconnect from everything. I wanted a cabin, isolated, without neighbors, no one around for miles. The kind of place where the only sounds were wind through the trees and birds in the morning. When I finally spotted the small dirt road leading off the main highway, flanked by tall pines, I felt a strange sense of relief. The road was rough and uneven, and my car bounced over potholes and loose rocks, each jolt reminding me that I was moving farther away from the safety of civilization. The cabin appeared after another mile, tucked between two large oaks, almost hidden unless you knew where to look. It was small, wooden, weathered by years of storms and sun. The roof sagged slightly, and the paint had peeled off in large strips, but it had character. It looked like a place that had been built to last but never to impress. A thin trail of smoke rising from the chimney suggested someone might have been there recently, but as I drove closer, I saw the front door was closed, and there was no movement around the cabin. I parked, leaving my engine running for a moment as I looked around. The air smelled sharp, clean, like pine needles and wet earth. The forest seemed alive, but not in a comforting way. Every movement of a branch or distant rustle of leaves made me jump slightly, as though the trees were watching me. Inside, the cabin was cold, even though the afternoon sun was still bright. The air smelled of old wood, dampness, and something faintly metallic that I couldn't identify. The interior was simple: a small living area with a worn couch, a wooden table with uneven legs, a tiny kitchen with a stove that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in weeks, and a small bedroom in the back with a thin mattress. I set my bags down and walked slowly through the cabin, noting every detail. Nothing seemed out of place, but the silence pressed against my ears like a weight. There were no sounds except the wind rattling the loose boards on the outside walls and the occasional creak of the floor under my steps. After unpacking, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The forest was thick, the trees old and close together, with roots snaking across the ground like veins. I followed a narrow path that ran along the edge of the cabin, noticing signs of animals: deer tracks in the soft soil, small holes dug by rodents, and a few bird feathers caught on branches. As I walked deeper, I realized the isolation I had wanted so badly was absolute. There were no distant sounds of cars, no planes, no voices, just the forest and me. The feeling was exhilarating at first, but as the sun began to lower in the sky, it shifted. Shadows stretched unnaturally long between the trunks, and the wind began to whistle through the branches, creating sounds that resembled whispers, though I knew logically it was only the trees. Returning to the cabin, I decided to light the fireplace. The cabin had a small stack of firewood in the corner, and I set to work, arranging the logs, striking matches, and watching as the small flames slowly grew into a steady fire. The warmth was comforting, and the light pushed back some of the darkness that had begun to creep in from the corners of the room. Sitting on the couch, I could see the flicker of the fire dancing across the walls, and I tried to convince myself that the strange feeling I had in the forest was just my imagination. As night fell, I prepared a simple dinner, heating canned food on the stove. The sound of the flames and the occasional pop from the fireplace kept some of my anxiety at bay, but the silence outside was so complete it felt unnatural. When I went to bed that night, I left the cabin window slightly open, wanting to hear the forest. But even that sound, the soft rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, felt strange, almost menacing. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the groans of the cabin settling and the occasional crash of a branch against the side of the cabin. The next morning, I awoke to an eerie stillness. The air was thick with fog, the kind that blankets everything and distorts distance. I wrapped myself in a coat and stepped outside. The forest seemed different in the fog, every tree a looming figure, every shadow stretching like a dark finger. I noticed tracks near the cabin that I hadn't seen before. Deep footprints, larger than mine, heading from the edge of the forest toward the cabin and then disappearing into the trees again. My heart raced, but I told myself it was likely a deer or some other large animal. Still, I made sure the door and windows were locked. As the day wore on, I attempted to distract myself with chores around the cabin. I fixed a loose floorboard, cleaned the kitchen, and gathered more firewood. But the feeling of being watched never left me. Occasionally, I would catch a movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping behind a tree, a rustle in the underbrush. Each time, I convinced myself it was an animal, but deep down, I knew something was different this time. The forest was not just alive, it was aware. By the third day, the unease had grown. I noticed signs of disturbance around the cabin. Small scratches on the door frame, a piece of firewood moved from its stack, something that hadn't been there before. My mind raced with possibilities, but I tried to stay rational. Maybe it was an animal, maybe it was the wind, maybe I had just not seen it before. But when I found a set of larger footprints leading to the edge of the forest, and faintly, a broken branch suggesting someone or something had brushed past it, I began to feel genuinely unsafe. That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees and shadows lengthened, I heard the first unmistakable sound that made my stomach drop. Footsteps crunching on the dead leaves outside the cabin. They were slow, deliberate, coming closer. My pulse raced, and I considered leaving immediately, but the car was parked in the clearing, and the underbrush was thick. Moving quietly to the window, I peeked outside. A figure was there, hunched slightly, moving between the trees, pausing as if listening. I could barely make out the shape in the dimming light, but it wasn't an animal. I stayed frozen, watching as the figure lingered near the edge of the clearing, then slowly moved back into the trees. I debated calling for help, but there was no cell signal. The cabin phone line had been dead, likely long before I arrived. I realized then that I was completely cut off. I spent the night in the living room with the fireplace roaring, firewood at hand, an old hunting knife on the table. Every shadow on the wall seemed alive, every sound amplified by my own fear. I didn't sleep that night. I just waited, listening, watching. The next day, I decided I couldn't stay. I packed quickly, taking only essentials, and kept glancing over my shoulder as I made my way to the car. The forest seemed unusually quiet, almost as though it was holding its breath. I drove slowly, constantly scanning the tree line, expecting to see the figure again. Nothing appeared. When I reached the highway, relief flooded through me. I felt as though I had escaped, as though the cabin and the forest were still there, watching, waiting, but I was free. I never returned to that cabin. Months later, I learned that a man had been living in the woods nearby, hiding from authorities, and that the tracks I had seen likely belonged to him. It made sense of the fear, the unease, and the feeling that I was not alone. I realized I had been lucky. The forest had been silent because he hadn't wanted me to hear him until he chose to reveal himself. And by the time I left, I had avoided a potentially dangerous encounter. I kept the experience to myself, but the memory stayed. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can see the fog, the trees, and the shadow of that figure moving just out of reach, a reminder of how fragile safety can be when isolation meets the unknown. It was early autumn when I decided to take a break from the city. The constant noise, the endless rush of people, and the suffocating weight of schedules had built up into something I could no longer ignore. I found a cabin online, somewhere deep in the forest, far from roads, far from any neighbors, where the only sounds were meant to be birds in the morning and the wind through the trees at night. I wanted solitude, quiet, and the chance to be completely alone with my thoughts. The drive up to the cabin was longer than I had anticipated. The directions led me through narrow dirt paths lined with towering pines that blocked out almost all sunlight. The air had changed by the time I got out of the car. It was heavier, crisper, and smelled faintly of wet leaves and wood. When I finally reached the cabin, I found it tucked into a small clearing. It was modest, built of rough logs with a stone chimney, the kind of structure that could have survived decades of harsh winters. A thin layer of moss clung to the roof, and the windows, although dusty, reflected the dim light of the overcast sky. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of smoke and old wood. It was sparsely furnished. Just a table, 2 chairs, a small couch, and a bed in the corner. But that was enough. There was a wood stove stacked with logs, and a small kitchen area with a sink and some cupboards. It wasn't luxurious, but it was exactly what I wanted. Simple, isolated, and functional. The first night was quiet in a way I hadn't experienced in years. There were no cars, no distant sirens, no muffled conversations from neighbors, just the occasional rustle of leaves, the creak of the wooden floorboards under my own weight, and the soft hum of the wind through the trees. I settled into a routine. I would wake with the sun, walk through the forest, gather some firewood, read a little, and cook simple meals. By the second day, I began noticing small things that unsettled me. It started with noises outside the cabin at night, scraping sounds along the wooden walls, light thumps on the roof. At first, I attributed them to animals, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel climbing around. But the sounds were too consistent, too deliberate, and sometimes I could hear them moving from one side of the cabin to the other. I told myself it was just my imagination. I was alone, after all, and the mind tends to play tricks when surrounded by silence. But as the day went on, I found small signs that made me pause. The firewood I had stacked neatly in the corner was sometimes slightly disturbed, a log moved by just a few inches. My shoes, which I always left in the corner by the door, were sometimes not in the same position I had left them. I began checking the locks on the doors multiple times a day, even though the cabin was in the middle of nowhere and no one could have gotten there without me noticing. On the third day, things escalated. I had been chopping wood outside when I heard a sharp crack from behind me, like someone stepping on a branch. I spun around, but the forest was empty. My heart raced, and I grabbed a long stick for a makeshift weapon, though I knew it wouldn't do much against a determined intruder. I went back inside and locked the door, sitting with my back to the wall, listening. The scraping and thumping returned that night, louder and more persistent. Every time I tried to calm myself, I could feel the tension building in my chest, a tightness that made it hard to breathe. The next morning, I woke to a sight that made my stomach drop. The front door, which I had locked the night before, was slightly ajar. I didn't remember unlocking it. I checked the locks again, more thoroughly this time, and bolted it. I examined the perimeter of the cabin, but there were no footprints in the mud, no signs of anyone approaching. I could only conclude that whoever or whatever had been there had done so without leaving any trace. My anxiety started to turn into fear. That day, I decided to leave the cabin, at least for a while. I wanted to go back into the forest, try to find a path to the nearest road, maybe catch a ride with someone passing by. But as I packed a small bag with essentials, I realized something. The forest was disorienting. Trees looked the same, shadows fell in strange ways, and every direction seemed like it could lead me deeper into isolation instead of out. I had underestimated how easy it would be to lose one's sense of direction out there. Hours passed as I wandered, trying to remember landmarks I had seen on my way in. The forest closed in around me. Branches scraped my arms and face, fallen leaves muffled my footsteps, and the wind carried sounds that made me jump. A distant snap, a rustle that might have been an animal or something else. I stopped frequently to rest, my heart pounding, and each time I looked around, the cabin was nowhere in sight. Panic started to set in. I was unprepared to spend a night out in the open. I had no emergency supplies beyond what I carried, no way to start a fire easily, and the sun was already dropping toward the horizon. Eventually, exhausted and terrified, I found a small clearing and decided to make a temporary shelter with branches and leaves. I gathered whatever I could find, building a crude lean-to against a fallen tree. The night was cold, and I shivered under the thin layer of leaves I managed to collect. All night, I lay awake, listening to the forest. There were noises, low growls in the distance, snapping twigs nearby, the constant scraping and rustling that I could no longer attribute to imagination. I felt completely exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone. When morning came, I forced myself to move. I walked in what I hoped was the general direction of the cabin. The sun had risen enough to give me some light, but the forest still felt vast, endless, and unwelcoming. Hours passed. Hunger gnawed at me, and my legs ached. My mind was consumed with fear and self-recrimination. I had come here for peace, and instead, I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making. By late afternoon, I stumbled upon a small stream. I followed it, reasoning that water sources often lead to paths or roads. The terrain was rough, steep in places, but I pressed on, driven by desperation. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, I saw something through the trees, the outline of my cabin. Relief washed over me in a way I had never experienced before. It was exactly as I had left it, though the door was still slightly ajar from the night I had tried to leave. I went inside, locked the door, and sank to the floor. I realized then that my fear hadn't come from ghosts or shadows, but from the simple, terrifying reality of isolation and vulnerability. The forest was indifferent to my presence, and I had underestimated how dangerous that indifference could be. For the first time, I fully appreciated the importance of preparation, awareness, and respect for nature. Over the next few days, I took careful steps to secure the cabin. I reinforced the locks, built a small barricade against the door, and moved all my supplies into more secure locations. I mapped the surrounding area carefully, marking trees and paths so that I could navigate without becoming lost again. I learned to listen more closely, to distinguish between animal sounds and the subtle hints that someone, or something, might be approaching. Eventually, the fear began to ebb. I regained my routine: chopping wood, cooking simple meals, walking in the forest, reading in the quiet moments. But I was changed. The cabin, once a symbol of escape and solitude, had become a lesson in vigilance and respect. I never again took the isolation for granted, and I never again underestimated the quiet, patient dangers that could exist in such a place. By the end of my stay, I had a clear plan. I had learned the terrain, secured the cabin, and prepared enough food and firewood to feel safe. I packed up my belongings with a newfound sense of control, confident that I could leave at any moment if necessary. As I drove away, I looked back at the cabin, nestled in the forest, and felt a strange combination of relief and pride. I had faced the isolation and fear head-on, survived the uncertainty and danger, and emerged wiser and stronger for it. The experience stayed with me, not as a tale of horror, but as a vivid memory of resilience, awareness, and the raw, indifferent reality of being alone in the wilderness. I had always thought of myself as someone who could handle isolation. I liked the quiet, the emptiness, the sense of being removed from the constant noise of people, traffic, and obligations. That was the main reason I decided to spend a week in a small, remote cabin deep in the mountains. The place was off-grid, accessible only by a narrow dirt path that twisted and wound through dense forests, and it had no cell reception, no internet, and no neighbors within miles. It was exactly the kind of isolation I wanted. I packed carefully, bringing enough food, water, and supplies for a week, along with books, notebooks, and tools to keep myself occupied. My plan was to write, to think, and to be completely alone for the first time in years. The first day went exactly as I had hoped. The drive up the winding mountain road was long and slow, but the air was crisp and clean, and the forest was dense and full of life. I could hear birds, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the distant murmur of a stream. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin itself was small and weathered, made of rough timber that had darkened over the years. The windows were dusty, the roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the porch creaked under my weight as I stepped inside. Inside, the space was basic but functional. A small kitchen area, a living room with a wood stove, and a bedroom with a bed that had a thick, worn quilt. There was a stack of firewood against the wall, and a small outhouse a short walk away. Everything smelled faintly of pine and old wood. I spent the first evening unpacking and settling in. I built a fire in the stove, boiled water for tea, and sat by the window looking out at the forest. The shadows were long and heavy, and the air smelled damp. I noticed how different the forest felt when I was alone in it, how the sound seemed sharper, the wind more insistent, the darkness more absolute. I reminded myself that there was nothing to fear, that I was prepared, and that the isolation was part of the experience I had chosen. Still, a subtle unease crawled along the edges of my mind. It wasn't fear exactly, just a faint awareness of being completely alone. That night, I slept poorly. The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin's old shutters. Every creak and groan of the wood seemed louder than it should have, and I found myself waking repeatedly, listening, straining to hear something that wasn't there. In the morning, I decided to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just the unfamiliarity of the place. I spent the day exploring the nearby woods, walking along the path I had driven in on, observing the small animals and birds, and making notes for my writing. Everything was normal. Everything was calm. It was on the second evening that the first real sign that something might be off appeared. I was stacking firewood for the night when I noticed footprints in the soft earth near the cabin. At first, I assumed it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the prints were strange. They were large, flat, and appeared to be made by boots, not hooves or paws. They led up from the woods toward the cabin and then disappeared around the side, where they were covered by shadows and fallen leaves. My first instinct was to rationalize. Someone else might be staying nearby, or maybe hikers had passed through earlier in the day. But the thought made a tight knot form in my stomach. I checked all the windows and doors. Everything was locked and undisturbed inside. I told myself again that there was no reason to worry, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The night that followed was long and restless. I kept the stove fire going late, glancing out the windows every few minutes. The wind had died down, leaving an unnatural stillness. The forest beyond the cabin was black, absolute, and I could hear even the faintest sounds. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird that had stayed out later than usual. Around midnight, I thought I heard a low sound outside, a dragging or shuffling, but when I got up and looked, there was nothing. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, that the shadows played tricks on the mind when one was alone and tense. I eventually forced myself back to bed, but sleep did not come easily, and every little sound pulled me awake again. The third day, I decided to explore farther from the cabin, taking a trail that descended into a narrow valley. The air was cooler there, damp and heavy with the smell of moss and wet earth. The forest was denser, and the sunlight barely reached the ground through the thick canopy of leaves. As I walked, I felt increasingly uneasy. The sense of being alone was growing oppressive, and every distant sound seemed closer, sharper, as if someone or something was moving just out of sight. I told myself repeatedly that there was nothing unusual about the valley, nothing to fear, but the tension was building in my chest like a coiled spring. By late afternoon, I had reached a small clearing with a shallow stream running through it. I knelt to drink from the water and rest, scanning the forest around me. That's when I noticed something that made my heart skip. A faint trail in the mud along the stream, footprints that were unmistakably human. They were fresh, and they seemed to circle the clearing, as if someone had been watching me. I froze, looking around, but there was no one. I thought about heading back immediately, but the trail was long and winding, and I wanted to see if it led anywhere. My curiosity overcame my caution. I followed the footprints upstream, moving slowly, every sense alert. The trail led me deeper into the woods, where the trees grew closer together and the underbrush became thick and thorny. The forest seemed to close in around me, the sounds of the stream fading behind me as the shadows lengthened. The footprints eventually stopped near a small, abandoned shed that I had not noticed on the map. It was old and dilapidated, with moss-covered walls and a roof sagging under years of neglect. The door was slightly ajar, and I felt a sudden, sharp pang of fear. I stepped closer, peering inside. The interior was dark, filled with old tools, rotting wood, and debris. Nothing was moving, nothing alive was there. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm myself. Perhaps it had been a hiker or someone from a nearby property, someone curious or careless. Still, as I turned to head back to the cabin, I realized I had lost track of time. The sun was lower now, and the shadows were long and threatening. I quickened my pace, moving along the trail I thought I had come in on. But soon I realized the forest had shifted. The trail was faint, the landmarks unfamiliar. I stopped, scanning the area, and a cold fear took hold. I was lost. The sense of being alone in the forest, already tense, became overwhelming. I tried to retrace my steps, but every path seemed the same, every tree indistinguishable from the last. Panic began to creep in, but I forced myself to breathe, to think logically. I remembered the small compass I had brought and pulled it from my pocket. I knew the cabin was roughly to the northeast, based on my memory of the terrain. I oriented myself and began walking carefully, marking my path with small scratches in the bark of trees and tying pieces of string to branches to track where I had been. Hours passed, the forest darkened, and the shadows deepened. My water supply was low, my stomach ached, and my legs burned with exhaustion. I kept going, knowing I could not stop, could not fall asleep out here. I told myself repeatedly that the cabin was just ahead, that I could survive this, that I had prepared for emergencies. At some point in the night, the sense of being watched returned, stronger than ever. Every rustle, every snap of a twig, made my heart race. I paused, listening, and then I heard something unmistakable. Footsteps, deliberate and slow, approaching me. My blood ran cold. I ducked behind a tree, trying to make myself small, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps passed, but I could hear them circling, always staying just out of sight. I realized then that I was not alone. Someone, or something, was out there with me, moving quietly through the forest. I kept moving, faster now, trying to stay quiet, trying to reach the cabin before whatever was could find me. Eventually, dawn began to break. I was exhausted, bleeding from minor scrapes on my arms and legs, dehydrated and terrified. But I saw a familiar tree, a bend in the path I recognized. Relief flooded me. I stumbled, running as fast as my legs could carry me, and finally, hours after I had left the clearing, I reached the cabin. I bolted the door, checked every window, and collapsed on the floor, shivering from adrenaline, fear, and exhaustion. I realized then that I had been followed, that someone had been tracking me in the forest, and that the isolation I had sought had become a trap. I spent the rest of that day reinforcing the cabin. I tied heavy furniture against the doors, nailed boards over the windows, and made sure I had plenty of water and food close at hand. I had been driving all day, the road twisting through dense forest and up into the higher elevations where the air turned crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine and wet earth. I had planned this trip for months, the idea of escaping the constant noise and pressure of the city appealing more and more with each passing week. A cabin deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town, sounded perfect. My mind kept running scenarios of sitting on the porch, a mug of coffee warming my hands, and simply listening to nothing but the wind and the occasional distant bird. I had told myself I would be alone, that I wanted solitude, that I could handle it. I was confident, or perhaps foolishly so. The cabin was marked on a map I had printed from an obscure online forum. It wasn't on Google Maps, which made me feel like I was on the verge of discovering something truly remote. My car bounced over gravel and dirt roads, the tires crunching against loose stones. The forest thickened around me, trees growing so close that their branches seemed to brush the roof of my car, the canopy above dimming the late afternoon sun. I noticed the silence, which was different from the silence of a city apartment at night. Here, the absence of human noise was almost oppressive. It made me hyper-aware of every small sound. The distant snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves as a bird took off, even the sound of my own heartbeat as I approached a fork in the road I hadn't expected. The road ended in a small clearing where the cabin stood. It was not new or pristine. Its wood was weathered, gray in the fading light, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle, though I suspected it would hold. The porch had a few chairs stacked against the wall, and the windows, though dusty, were intact. There was a smell in the air, a mix of damp wood, pine, and something metallic. I couldn't place it at first, but it reminded me vaguely of old garages or tools left in rain. The place was undeniably isolated. There were no neighbors, no other vehicles, not even a trail leading further in any direction. I felt a flicker of unease, but pushed it aside. I was here for solitude after all. I started unloading my supplies. A bag with clothes, a few cans of food, water, my small camping stove, and a flashlight. I had packed meticulously, planning for every scenario I could imagine. And yet, now that I was here, I realized I might have underestimated how alone I would feel. The forest was alive, though not with the friendliness I had imagined. It was alive in the way that reminded me humans were intruders in this place. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying sounds I could not always identify. A deer moved somewhere unseen, the sound of its hooves brushing against undergrowth sending a shiver up my spine. I tried to shake the thought that I was being watched, but the feeling lingered. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. There was a wood stove in the corner, a small table with 2 chairs, and a bed with a thin mattress that had clearly seen better days. The floors creaked under my weight, the boards uneven and warped in some places. I began to unpack, arranging my things so that the cabin felt more like a temporary home than a stranger's abandoned property. There was a sense of accomplishment, of settling in, that made the place feel warmer despite the cool air. I opened the windows to let in fresh air, though the forest outside seemed to press in from all sides. Light fell unevenly through the dirty glass, casting long shadows on the walls. I felt a strange thrill at being somewhere so remote, and yet there was also an undeniable tension in the air. I spent the first few hours cleaning and organizing. I swept the floor, wiped down surfaces, and arranged firewood next to the stove. The sound of the broom bristles scraping the floor echoed in the cabin, the silence making every noise feel magnified. As evening approached, I built a small fire in the stove, the smell of burning wood filling the space. The light flickered against the walls, creating moving shadows that seemed almost alive. I sat in one of the chairs, a blanket over my legs, listening to the forest as it shifted from day to night. The temperature dropped sharply, and I noticed the way the cabin's walls absorbed the cold. My fingers grew stiff despite the fire, and I realized that being alone meant not only solitude but also having to deal with everything on my own. Night fell completely. The forest outside was no longer a collection of shapes and shadows but an impenetrable darkness. I could hear owls calling somewhere far away, and the wind seemed stronger, pushing against the structure of the cabin. I had brought a flashlight, but I hesitated to use it, afraid that any beam of light would highlight my isolation, make me feel even smaller against the vastness of the woods. Instead, I kept the fire going, careful to add wood gradually, listening to the soft crackle. That's when I first noticed the sound of footsteps outside. At first, I thought it might be an animal. Deer and raccoons were common here, and their movements could easily mimic human footsteps in the forest. I froze, trying to locate the source of the sound. The steps were deliberate, heavier than I expected, and they circled the cabin. My heart began to race. I reminded myself that this place was public, at least in the sense that anyone could find it if they knew where to look. But the sound didn't fade. It continued, slow and measured, moving closer and farther, always surrounding the cabin. I gripped a piece of firewood, my only weapon, and sat completely still, listening. The firelight cast long, trembling shadows across the walls, and I realized I had never felt this vulnerable in my life. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time seemed warped in the darkness, and the sound finally stopped. I did not dare to move until I was sure of the silence. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Someone could be following me, watching, waiting for me to leave the cabin. I thought about the car, parked out in the clearing, the keys in my pocket. Could I make it to the road and get help if I needed to? I had no cell service, no way to call anyone. I realized that my plan for solitude had blinded me to the potential danger of being this far from help. I felt the first real touch of fear, sharp and cold. Sleep was impossible. I lay on the thin mattress, listening to the forest, aware of every creak of the cabin, every distant snap of a branch. I imagined shapes moving just outside the windows, felt the chill of the night settle over me, and realized I had underestimated not just the isolation but the intensity of being alone in it. The hours crawled by. I didn't try to sleep. I couldn't. Instead, I focused on the fire, on keeping it going, on keeping my mind occupied. Dawn felt like it would never come. When morning finally arrived, it was not with the relief I expected. The forest was gray with early light, mist hanging low over the trees. I felt exhausted but alive. Stepping outside, I scanned the clearing. There were no tracks around the cabin except my own from unloading supplies. The feeling of being watched the night before lingered, but there was no evidence of intrusion. I forced myself to breathe, to take in the morning air, and to move methodically through the tasks of starting the day. I chopped more firewood, refilled my water, and started preparing a simple breakfast. Each action felt like reclaiming a small piece of control in a place that had seemed overwhelming and threatening just hours before. The next few days followed a rhythm that was both comforting and nerve-wracking. I explored the area immediately surrounding the cabin, marking boundaries and familiarizing myself with paths. I found a small creek where the water was clear and cold, and I washed my hands and face there, marveling at the crispness of it. I collected firewood in the daylight, cleaned the cabin more thoroughly, and began to feel a cautious confidence return. Yet I remained vigilant. Every rustle, every movement in the undergrowth reminded me of the night before. I kept a careful eye on my surroundings, aware that this place offered no guarantee of safety. On the fourth night, something happened that forced me to confront just how vulnerable I was. I was in the cabin, tending the fire, when I noticed a faint light moving through the trees. It was small at first, flickering like a lantern or flashlight. My stomach sank. Someone was outside, and this time, I knew it was not an animal. I could hear the soft crunch of boots on gravel, the weight of deliberate movement. My heart pounded as I realized that I was entirely alone, and whoever was out there had the advantage of surprise. I moved quietly to the window, trying to keep hidden in the shadows, and watched as the light moved closer, circling the cabin. My mind raced through possibilities. Neighbors? Hikers? Someone with ill intent? The answer didn't matter. I had no way to communicate, no one to warn, no means of defense other than my own wits. I remembered the car, the keys, the road. I had to act, but I also had to be careful. If this person or people noticed me, I could be trapped. I waited for the light to pass out of view, and then, with my heart in my throat, I grabbed my backpack, the most essential supplies, and made a careful. I had been driving for hours along the narrow, winding roads of the forested mountains. The sky was overcast, and a low mist clung to the edges of the trees, softening the dark greens and browns into a kind of blurry haze. I could barely see the road in front of me, and I had to keep slowing down whenever a curve approached. The cabin I had rented was somewhere deep in this forest, far from the nearest town or gas station. It was exactly what I wanted. A week completely cut off from the world, away from emails, phones, and the constant noise of the city. I had been so desperate to leave everything behind that the thought of isolation excited me more than it scared me. The last mile of the drive was practically invisible. Gravel crunched under the tires, and the car swayed slightly as the road became uneven. I could hear the distant sound of water, probably a creek running alongside the road, but it was mostly swallowed by the wind through the pine trees. I had a vague sense of relief when I finally saw the cabin. It was small, wooden, with a sharply peaked roof and a porch that wrapped around one side. It looked abandoned from a distance, but that was exactly what I wanted. The smell of wet wood and moss hit me as soon as I got out of the car. I felt the damp chill in my bones immediately, despite wearing a thick jacket. I started unloading my bags. Everything was quiet except for the wind and the distant hum of water. No birds, no other people, nothing. The cabin was old, the wood darkened with age and moisture, but it was solid. I opened the door and stepped inside. The air was musty, a mixture of damp wood, old blankets, and something I couldn't immediately place, a faint metallic scent. The floorboards creaked beneath me, and I had to be careful where I stepped. The cabin was simple. A small kitchen with a sink that looked like it hadn't been used in years, a tiny stove, a table, and a few chairs. A narrow stair led to a loft where the bed was. I dropped my bags and decided to start a fire. The cabin had a fireplace, and there was a small stack of wood in the corner. As I worked, I noticed something unsettling. The wood for the fireplace was damp, the kind that smoked rather than burned. I struggled to get a fire going, coughing when the smoke filled the small room. The wind outside seemed to howl louder, rattling the windows and doors. Eventually, I managed to get the flames steady, and the room filled with a warm glow. I sat down in the chair closest to the fire, listening to the woods around me. At first, everything was just the sound of the wind and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. But after a while, I began to notice other noises. A snap, like a branch breaking, a few feet from the window. I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I tried to ignore it. I told myself the isolation was getting to me. Being alone for the first night always made the mind play tricks. I went to the loft and unpacked a few things, setting my sleeping bag over the old mattress. The loft felt tight and closed in, with only a small window looking out over the trees. The mist outside blurred everything. I couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something moving outside. The sound of something dragging, a soft shuffle. I kept telling myself it was just leaves or twigs falling. The wind made the shadows dance against the walls. The cabin groaned in the way old wood does, and every noise sounded amplified in the quiet. At some point in the night, I woke to a sharp knock against the cabin wall. Not a branch, not the wind. A solid, deliberate knock. My heart raced and I froze. I couldn't see anything through the misty window, but I could feel the weight of something out there. I stayed in the loft for what felt like hours, listening to the knocks. They came sporadically, sometimes from the porch, sometimes from the side of the cabin. I had no weapon, nothing to defend myself. My phone had no signal, and the nearest road was miles away. The rational part of my brain told me it was probably an animal, maybe a bear curious about the fire. But then, there was a different sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching in the gravel. They circled the cabin, moving from one side to the other. Every time the sound paused, the knocking would resume. I could see shadows through the thin curtains, shifting just slightly with every movement. I stayed completely still, holding my breath. Eventually, the footsteps seemed to retreat, fading into the mist and the distance. I waited for a long time, listening to the silence. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and I fell asleep. I woke early, sweating, my heart still pounding. The first thing I did was check the door. Nothing had been moved, no sign of forced entry. The porch was empty except for wet footprints in the mud, human footprints. Big ones. They led around the cabin and disappeared into the trees. I traced them carefully. They hadn't come close to the door. Whoever or whatever had been outside had stayed just out of reach, watching. For the next day, I kept a careful routine. I didn't leave the cabin except for short walks to stretch my legs, always keeping the fire burning and checking the locks on the doors and windows. The sounds came sporadically. The snap of branches, the soft drag of something along the ground, but no one ever came close. I realized I couldn't rely on luck. I had to prepare. I found a heavy metal rod outside, maybe an old railing, and brought it inside for protection. I moved furniture near the windows where I could see without being exposed. The second night was worse. The knocking returned, louder this time. I could hear someone breathing outside, slow and deliberate. I pressed myself against the loft railing, gripping the metal rod. The footsteps circled, and then I heard a voice, low and muffled, calling out a name I didn't recognize. I froze. Whoever it was knew I was there, but they hadn't tried to break in yet. I stayed as quiet as possible, counting each breath, willing them to leave. Eventually, the noises stopped. Daylight came and I saw the footprints again, larger and deeper this time, leading off into the forest. I realized I couldn't stay passive anymore. I spent the day preparing traps and barricades. I found old cans, rocks, anything that could make noise if someone came close. I reinforced the door with the rod and extra furniture. I also made a plan. If they tried to get inside, I would retreat to the loft where I could see everything and call for help as soon as I got a signal. I rationed my food and water carefully. The third night, the pattern continued, but I stayed awake this time, ready. Around midnight, I saw shadows moving along the edge of the porch. I grabbed the rod and stood ready. The figure paused, a man wearing dark clothing, standing motionless in the mist. I realized he was watching the cabin, studying it, probably looking for a way in. I didn't move. I waited. After what felt like forever, he turned and disappeared into the mist. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay. I packed as quickly as possible, taking only essentials. I planned a route along the creek, which I hoped would lead to a road. The forest was dense, wet, and treacherous, but I moved fast, keeping my senses alert for any sign of the man from the cabin. The forest seemed endless. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves set my heart racing. I followed the creek for hours, sometimes climbing over fallen logs or squeezing through tight gaps. My clothes were soaked, my hands raw from gripping branches and rocks. By evening, I stumbled onto a dirt road. I ran along it until I saw headlights in the distance. I waved frantically. The truck slowed, and the driver stopped. I explained as quickly as I could, pointing back toward the forest. He listened, nodding, then drove me to the nearest town, where I called the police. They went to the cabin with a team. When they returned, they told me no one had been living there recently. No evidence of habitation, no food, no supplies. The only trace of the man or men who had been watching me were the deep footprints around the cabin. I never went back. The forest seemed harmless during the day, quiet and beautiful. But I knew that night, someone had been out there, stalking me, close enough to see me but careful enough to avoid detection. It had been real, terrifyingly real. The relief didn't come immediately. I stayed in the town for a few days, sleeping in a hotel, eating warm meals, and trying to calm my nerves. I took walks during the day, staying near the main streets, always watching for shadows. Gradually, the fear faded, replaced by a cautious confidence. I knew the forest was dangerous, but I also knew I had survived by keeping my wits about me, by preparing, and by trusting my instincts. I left the town eventually, returning to the city, forever changed, but alive. I never forgot the cabin or the footsteps in the mist, but I also never forgot the feeling of managing to escape, to survive, to take control of a situation that could have ended in disaster. That was the real ending, the clarity that even in isolation, even when dangers I had been driving for hours on a narrow, twisting road through dense forest, the kind where sunlight barely touched the ground, and the trees crowded so close together that even the most direct path seemed constricted. I had no real plan when I decided to take this route. I only knew I wanted to get away from the city, from the noise, the people, the constant pressure to perform and respond. My work, my emails, the calls I couldn't answer fast enough. They all piled up in my mind until I couldn't breathe. A small cabin that I had found online seemed perfect. The photos promised isolation, a lake, and the forest all around. It looked like peace, a place where I could be alone without distraction. The road deteriorated quickly. Asphalt gave way to gravel, and the gravel was peppered with potholes and roots that had broken through the surface. My tires crunched loudly, bouncing over the uneven ground. I felt the tension in my shoulders ease slightly with each mile, the thought of being disconnected from everything calming me. But at the same time, a small part of me noticed how alone I truly was. Cell service had disappeared about 20 minutes back, and the forest seemed to thicken with every turn. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw it. A narrow clearing with a small wooden cabin, built in a traditional rustic style, with a pitched roof and a wide porch. Smoke rose lazily from a stone chimney, though there was no one in sight. The surrounding trees were massive, dark, and seemed to watch silently. I parked the car and got out, the tires crunching on the gravel, the sound startling in the otherwise absolute quiet. The air smelled damp and earthy, rich with pine and wet soil. It was the smell of untouched forest, of decay and growth at the same time. The cabin was smaller than I expected. One room on the ground floor, a loft above, and a tiny porch with a swing. Everything looked worn but solid. There was a woodpile stacked neatly beside the cabin, and a small shed near the edge of the clearing. I opened the door carefully. Inside, the floor creaked slightly, and dust floated in the thin shafts of light from the windows. I dropped my bag and walked around, running my fingers over the wooden surfaces. Everything smelled of old wood and damp. The furniture was basic. A table, 2 chairs, a small stove, and a bed in the corner. A blanket was folded neatly on the bed. I set up my things and felt a strange mix of relief and unease. I was alone, completely, and yet I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in around me. The first night was calm, if tense. I lit a fire in the stove and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the flickering shadows. The forest outside was pitch black, a wall of darkness that seemed to swallow sound. I could hear the wind in the trees, the occasional snap of a branch, and the distant call of some night creature. I tried to relax, telling myself I had prepared, that I was just being cautious. But every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it. I didn't sleep much that night, lying awake in the cold, listening to the forest breathe. Morning brought clarity. Sunlight filtered through the trees, making patterns on the floor. The forest no longer seemed oppressive. I made coffee on the stove and stepped outside. The lake, hidden behind a small rise, shimmered in the morning light. Mist hung over the water like a thin curtain. I could hear birds calling, small ripples in the water as fish moved beneath the surface. I felt better, safer, more in control. I decided to spend the day exploring the area, mapping out paths, checking the perimeter, making sure there were no hazards nearby. The cabin sat at the edge of a thick forest, with the lake on one side and a steep slope leading up to more dense woods on the other. I followed an old trail, barely wide enough for one person, and walked deeper into the trees. The forest floor was damp, covered in fallen leaves and pine needles, and the air was heavy with the scent of moss. Birds darted through the branches, and small animals scurried away as I passed. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. There was a tension beneath the calm that I could feel, like the forest itself was holding its breath. By the second night, the isolation began to weigh on me. I had brought a stack of books, some food, and plenty of firewood, but the silence of the forest was overwhelming. Every little noise made me tense. I would be sitting, reading, and hear a branch snap or a low rustle in the undergrowth, and my heart would race. I reminded myself constantly that I was safe, that there was no one else out here, but the feeling of being watched was inescapable. On the third day, something happened that I wasn't expecting. I had gone to fetch water from a small stream a few hundred meters from the cabin. The trail was narrow and overgrown, and the forest seemed to close in around me. As I knelt to fill my bottle, I heard it, a low, guttural growl from deeper in the trees. My heart jumped. I froze, trying to locate the source, but all I could see was the dense brush and shadowed trunks. I slowly stood up, trying to make myself look larger, and the growl came again, closer this time. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the movement. Then I saw it. A large black bear, standing on all fours, staring directly at me. Its coat was thick and glossy, its eyes small and cold. I froze. The bear didn't move at first, just watched me, and I realized that I had no escape path except back the way I came, where the trail was narrow and the undergrowth thick. My mind raced. I remembered the advice. Don't run, make yourself big, slowly back away. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I took a careful step back, then another. The bear shifted slightly, and I noticed it wasn't alone. Behind it, partially hidden in the trees, was another smaller bear, likely a cub. My stomach dropped. I backed slowly, my fingers gripping the bottle like a weapon, trying not to make sudden movements. The growl came again, low and threatening, and I realized I had no choice but to retreat to the cabin. I moved as calmly as I could, never turning my back, and finally broke through the treeline. The cabin came into view, and I bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind me and locking it. I leaned against it, heart racing, hands shaking. Outside, I could hear the bear sniffing around, and then the sounds faded as it moved back into the forest. That night, I barely slept. I reinforced the windows with furniture, piled extra wood in front of the door, and kept a fire going all night. Every noise outside made me jump. I couldn't see the bears, but I knew they were out there, somewhere possibly watching. The isolation that had felt peaceful just days ago now felt dangerous, claustrophobic, suffocating. I realized that I had underestimated the reality of being alone in the wild. Over the next few days, I kept to the cabin. I rationed my food, collected water from the stream only when necessary, and stayed as quiet as possible. I watched the lake from the porch, noting movement in the trees, listening to the sounds of the forest. The bears didn't appear again, but I never felt safe. Every rustle, every shadow, every crack of a branch made my pulse spike. I became hyper-aware of everything, counting sounds, noting patterns, preparing for any potential encounter. The forest that had seemed tranquil before now felt alive and unpredictable, a place where one wrong step could mean serious injury or worse. By the end of the first week, I realized I couldn't stay indefinitely. I had no real communication with the outside world. No one knew exactly where I was, and the supplies I brought wouldn't last forever. I started planning my return. I mapped the trail in my head, noting landmarks, visual cues, and dangers. I prepared my backpack carefully, making sure I had enough food, water, and gear to make the journey safely. The forest seemed less menacing now that I had a plan, though the tension never fully left. The morning I decided to leave, the forest was silent. The air was cool, the lake calm, and the light soft through the trees. I packed methodically, checked the cabin one last time, and locked the door. As I stepped onto the trail, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief to leave the isolation, the tension, and the fear. Sadness for the beauty and rawness of the forest, and the quiet life that existed here untouched by people. The hike out was tense but uneventful. I kept to the trail, moving slowly and deliberately. The forest seemed to watch, as always, but there were no threats. When I finally reached the main gravel road, the sounds of cars in the distance felt like a lifeline. I could see civilization again, the markers of human presence, and I breathed a deep, long sigh. When I finally reached my car and started the engine, I felt a wave of exhaustion and relief crash over me. I looked back toward the forest, toward the cabin that had been my refuge and my nightmare, and I realized how much I had underestimated the power of isolation and the unpredictability of nature. I drove away slowly, carefully, and I had been planning the trip for months. I wanted a quiet escape from the city, from the constant hum of traffic, the glare of screens, and the ceaseless chatter of people. I found a small cabin online, tucked away in the mountains, far from the nearest town. The pictures made it look perfect. A wooden structure with a sloping roof, a stone chimney, and a small porch that overlooked a dense forest. The owner promised solitude, peace, and the chance to really be alone. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive up was longer than I expected. The roads narrowed as I left the main highway, turning into rough gravel paths that twisted through thick pine forests. At times I had to slow to a crawl, unsure if the ruts in the road could swallow my car's tires. The sky was overcast, and a pale mist clung to the trees, making the forest feel even denser and darker than it probably was. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the mountains, and shadows stretched across the clearing where the cabin sat. The cabin itself was smaller than I imagined, but it had character. The logs were dark with age, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. I parked and unloaded my bag, which contained nothing but essentials: food, water, a first aid kit, a small backpack, and a flashlight. I had deliberately chosen to travel light, planning to cook simple meals and spend the evenings reading and writing. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped on it, the air around me cool and slightly damp, smelling faintly of pine and earth. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood and old smoke. Dust clung to the corners, and the furniture looked like it had been there for decades. A worn couch, a small wooden table, a few chairs, and a single bed in the corner. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and I could see remnants of ashes inside it. There was a small kitchen area with a gas stove and a sink, though I noticed immediately that the water tap only dripped weakly. I decided I would have to rely on bottled water I had brought. The first night was quiet, too quiet. I sat by the window, reading, listening to the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Occasionally, a bird called somewhere deep in the forest, but beyond that, nothing. I tried to convince myself this was peaceful. It should be peaceful. But somewhere in the pit of my stomach, I felt a tightness, a sense of unease that I couldn't explain. The forest outside seemed alive in a way that was different from the city noise. There was a rhythm to it, subtle and irregular, like the place was breathing. I slept fitfully. Every creak of the cabin woke me, and I found myself staring at the walls, waiting for sounds that never came. Morning brought some relief. The mist had cleared, and the sunlight filtered through the trees, warming the porch. I went for a short walk, noticing the narrow path that led away from the cabin into the forest. It looked overgrown, and I wondered if anyone ever used it. I decided not to go far. I had no interest in getting lost, and I wanted to spend the day exploring closer to the cabin. I spent the next few days in a slow rhythm. I gathered firewood, cooked simple meals, and sat by the fireplace at night. The isolation was both exhilarating and unsettling. Every night, I would hear things I couldn't identify. Twigs snapping, the distant thump of some heavy animal moving through the underbrush, the occasional rustle that seemed too close to be a deer. I kept reminding myself I was alone, that the sounds were natural. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching from the trees. On the fourth night, the unease became sharper. I had just finished a small dinner, and the sun had disappeared behind the mountains. I lit a small lamp and sat at the table, reading. That's when I heard it. A soft, deliberate knock on the cabin door. I froze. The cabin was far from any road. No one could have just wandered up casually. My first instinct was to convince myself it was the wind. Old wood creaks, doors settle, branches hit the siding. But the knock repeated. Slow, deliberate, 3 distinct raps. My heart started to race. I stood slowly, gripping a flashlight in one hand, and moved cautiously toward the door. Outside, the forest seemed empty. I couldn't see anyone. I shined the flashlight around the clearing. The light swept over the tall pines, the uneven ground, and the edges of the porch, but there was nothing. I waited, listening, every sound amplified. The whisper of wind through the needles, the distant cry of a bird, the low groan of the cabin. Then a snap came from the side of the cabin, near the back. Something had moved. I backed away from the door. My mind raced through possibilities. A wild animal, maybe a deer or a bear, though a bear seemed unlikely. I had food inside, and I hadn't seen any sign of large animals nearby. But still, the sound had been deliberate, like someone stepping carefully over branches. My imagination ran wild. What if someone had been following me, waiting for the right moment? The cabin's isolation made it a perfect trap. I spent the next hour checking the windows, making sure they were locked, inspecting the back door, even scanning the treeline with the flashlight. Nothing. Yet the feeling of being watched persisted. I realized I had no cell service. I was truly alone, with no one able to help me. I resolved to sleep in the bed with my backpack and a small knife I kept in my pocket. I stayed awake for hours, listening. Every sound seemed magnified. My breathing felt loud in the silence. The next morning, I ventured into the forest cautiously. I needed to understand what had happened. I didn't go far, just enough to see if there were tracks or any sign of a person nearby. What I found unnerved me. A series of footprints leading toward the cabin from the far edge of the clearing. They were fresh, pressed into the soft soil, and larger than mine. The way they approached suggested someone had been watching the cabin, maybe even hiding in the forest, waiting. I hurried back, my heart pounding. My first thought was to leave immediately, but the car was down the rough road, and I felt a strange pull to stay. I rationalized that maybe it had been a lost hiker, someone who had wandered in from the mountains. But deep down, I knew the chances were slim. No one else had been expected, and the footprints were deliberate, not random. Over the next 2 days, I stayed alert, keeping the doors locked, listening carefully for any signs of intrusion. The sounds continued. Footsteps at night, branches breaking. The occasional low growl that could have been an animal but didn't match anything I recognized. Every time I went outside, I would check the perimeter, shining my flashlight into the dark corners where the forest met the clearing. I felt trapped in my own sanctuary. On the 6th night, I decided to prepare for the worst. I barricaded the doors with furniture, kept the knife close, and even placed some heavy objects near the windows so no one could enter unnoticed. I resolved to stay calm, to survive no matter what. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. Hours passed, and eventually exhaustion took over. I slept lightly, my body tense, ready to react to the slightest sound. At dawn, I awoke to silence. The forest was calm, peaceful even, and the sun shone through the windows. My relief was immediate. I cautiously approached the door, and what I saw made my stomach drop. Dozens of footprints in the soft ground around the cabin. Not all of them were fresh, but they were numerous, showing that whoever or whatever had been near the cabin had come and gone multiple times, perhaps even during the nights I had tried to sleep. I realized then that the cabin wasn't safe. I couldn't stay, no matter how beautiful the location was. I packed my belongings quickly, moving as quietly as possible. I checked every window and door, ensuring nothing had been left behind. As I started down the mountain road, I kept my eyes on the forest edges. Shadows moved unnaturally, shapes that could have been people hiding just beyond the trees. I drove fast but carefully, not daring to stop until I reached the main highway. Once I reached the nearest town, I felt the first real sense of relief. People, noise, other cars, proof that I was no longer alone. I checked into a small motel and called the local sheriff's office, reporting the footprints and the unusual occurrences at the cabin. They listened politely but warned me that the forest was vast, and it was unlikely they could investigate without more information. I never returned to that cabin. Months later, I saw it listed online again, the photos unchanged, the description promising solitude and peace. I shivered and closed the page. I realized that isolation, which I had sought, could be dangerous in ways I had never imagined. The forest hides more than trees and animals. It hides people, patience, and the patience of those who watch from the shadows. Even now, I think about that cabin, the footprints, and the nights I spent listening to the forest. I know what I experienced was real, tangible, and entirely human. No stories, no ghosts, no fantasies. Just I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. The idea of staying alone in a cabin deep in the woods seemed like the perfect way to get away from the constant noise of town, the endless routine of work, and the feeling of being stuck in the same cycle every day. I wanted to feel silence, to hear nothing but the wind and the trees, and to spend time away from people. I had rented a small cabin far from any major road, the kind you reached only by driving miles on a gravel path that twisted through thick forest. It was a simple wooden structure, nothing fancy, just a roof, walls, and a couple of rooms, but that was all I wanted. I had packed enough supplies for a week. Food, bottled water, some tools, a flashlight, extra batteries, a small first aid kit, and a knife I always carried when I went camping or hiking. The cabin was advertised as being off the grid, with no power and no plumbing, but it had a wood stove and a hand pump for water from a well outside. It sounded manageable, and I felt ready for it. When I pulled up to the place, the first thing I noticed was how isolated it really was. The trees surrounded it on all sides, tall pines that blocked much of the sky, and the gravel road ended right in front of it. Past the cabin, there was nothing but dense woods. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the furniture was simple. Just a wooden table, 2 chairs, a cot with a thin mattress, and shelves nailed to the walls. There was a small window on each side of the cabin, none of them very large, and each had an old curtain that looked like it had been there for decades. I set down my bags, looked around, and felt satisfied. This was exactly the sort of place I wanted. The first day went by without any problems. I unpacked slowly, took a short walk around the area, and got familiar with the surroundings. The woods were quiet, almost too quiet. No sound of cars, no people, just the occasional bird or the distant rustling of branches. By the evening, I started a small fire in the wood stove, heated some canned food, and sat by the table as the cabin grew darker. The sound of fire cracking in the stove was comforting, and I thought to myself how peaceful this week was going to be. That night, I lay on the cot and listened. The silence was deeper than anything I was used to. In town, even late at night, there were always cars in the distance or a dog barking or some kind of hum in the background. Here, it was absolute. At first, it was calming, but the longer I lay awake, the more I started to notice every little sound. A branch snapping somewhere outside, something brushing against the wall, a soft thud, like something falling in the woods. I told myself it was just animals, maybe deer or raccoons, and tried to push it from my mind. Eventually, I drifted into sleep. The next day, I explored further. I followed a narrow trail that seemed to lead away from the cabin into the deeper forest. The trees here were close together, their trunks tall and thin, the branches above forming a kind of ceiling that made the daylight seem dimmer. After about half an hour of walking, I came to a small clearing with the remains of what looked like an old campfire. The stones were still arranged in a circle, blackened in the middle. Whoever had used it hadn't been here in a while, but it was clear that people had camped out here before. I stood there for a while, trying to picture who it might have been. Hunters, maybe, or hikers. When I returned to the cabin, I felt more settled. I cooked, wrote a little in my notebook, and tried to enjoy the quiet. But that night, the noises started again. They were louder than before. I was lying in bed, the fire in the stove had burned down low, and I was just about to close my eyes when I heard the crunch of footsteps outside. Not the light, quick steps of an animal, but the slow, deliberate weight of someone walking on gravel or dry leaves. My body froze. I held my breath and listened. The steps stopped, then started again, closer this time, circling toward the side of the cabin. I sat up in the dark, every nerve in my body on edge. The sound moved slowly around the cabin, then stopped again. I waited, staring into the blackness, ears straining for the faintest noise. After a long pause, there was the creak of wood, like someone pressing against the wall or the porch. My mouth went dry. I reached for the flashlight beside my bed but didn't turn it on. I didn't want to make a sound. Minutes passed, each one dragging out longer than the last, until finally I heard the steps again, moving away into the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening for the sound to return. Didn't. By morning, I tried to convince myself it had just been an animal, but deep down I knew better. Animals don't walk like that. They don't circle a cabin slowly, pausing as if they're listening. The following day, I felt uneasy the entire time. Every snap of a twig made me turn my head. I noticed things I hadn't before. Scuff marks near the edge of the porch, a faint depression in the dirt that looked like a boot print. I tried to reason it out. Maybe someone had passed through recently. Maybe hunters still used these woods. But then I thought about how far the cabin was from anywhere else, and how the trail I had walked on had been faint, overgrown in places, as if it hadn't been used for a long time. That evening, I made sure the door was locked. The lock was just a simple latch, not much more than what you'd find on a shed, and it didn't make me feel safe. I pushed the table against the door too, just in case. The windows had no locks at all. Anyone who wanted to get in could do so without much effort. I kept the flashlight close, the knife within reach, and lay in bed with my ears open. The sounds came back again. At first, it was the same slow steps outside, circling, stopping, and starting again. Then I heard something else, the faint scrape of metal against wood. It was coming from the back of the cabin, near the small window. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I stayed still, trying not to make a sound, but every part of me wanted to get up and look. After a few minutes, the scraping stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. I forced myself to stay awake, to listen. I thought about shouting, just to scare whoever was away, but I held back. I didn't want them to know for sure that I was inside and awake. After what felt like hours, the sounds faded again into the woods. When daylight finally came, I got up and checked outside. Near the back window, there were marks on the wood, thin scratches like someone had dragged a blade or a piece of metal along it. It was no accident. Someone had been trying to scare me or test me. I thought about leaving that day, but the idea of driving back out alone on that long, narrow road made me nervous too. If whoever was out there knew I was inside, they might also know my car was parked right outside. I didn't like the thought of being followed down that road. I decided to wait to see if it would happen again, but part of me already regretted that choice. That night was worse than any before. The noises started earlier, before I had even gone to bed. A dull thud against the side of the cabin, like a hand or a boot kicking the wall. Then another thud and another. I sat in the dark, gripping the knife, my body shaking. The steps moved from one side of the cabin to the other, slow and steady. At one point, I heard something tap against the window, a soft but deliberate sound. I didn't look. I couldn't bring myself to. Hours went by like that. Sometimes there was silence, sometimes there were noises, scraping, tapping, thuds. I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the dark until the first light of morning came through the window. When I stepped outside, the air was cold, the woods still, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. On the ground near the cabin, I found more boot prints, clearer this time. They circled the cabin just like I had heard, stopping by each window, each wall, before moving back into the woods. I knew then that it wasn't random. Someone was watching me, testing me, maybe waiting for the right moment. I packed my bags quickly, shoving everything into the car. My hands were shaking so bad I could hardly get the keys into the ignition. As I drove down the gravel road, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see another vehicle following, but the road stayed empty behind me. It took hours before I reached the main highway again. When I finally did, I pulled over at a gas station and just sat there, breathing hard, trying to calm down. The relief of being around other people again was overwhelming. I looked back at my car, at the dirt and dust covering it from the road, and I thought about the nights I had spent in that cabin. I thought about the footsteps, the scratches, the tapping at the window. I never went back to that cabin. I never even contacted the owner again. I didn't want to know who else might have been out there, or why they circled the place night after night. All I knew was that if I had stayed one more night, I might not have made it out at all. I remember the first time I ever pulled my truck up the narrow dirt road that led to the cabin. The road wasn't much more than 2 tire ruts pressed into the earth, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to close in tighter the further I drove. The air was still and heavy, with only the sound of branches brushing against the sides of my truck. I had rented the cabin for a week because I wanted to be away from everything. Away from the constant noise of the city, the ringing of my phone, and the stress that had been sitting on me for months. I thought a week alone in the woods would clear my head. The cabin wasn't anything special. Just a square building with old wood siding and a metal roof that was rusting in places. The porch sagged a little, and the steps creaked when I walked on them. The windows were smudged, and the front door had a dent like someone had once kicked it. Still, it was quiet. Around me there was nothing but trees stretching in every direction. No sound of cars, no voices, no music from someone's house down the street. Just silence, broken every now and then by a bird call or the cracking of branches deep in the woods. I carried my bags inside. The place smelled like dust and old wood. The floorboards groaned under my weight. There was one main room with a couch, a table, and a small kitchen along the wall. In the back was a bedroom with a single bed and a bathroom that barely fit a shower and toilet. It wasn't cozy. It wasn't welcoming, but it was what I had asked for. A place to be completely alone. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked some food I had brought, walked around the property, and sat on the porch watching the woods. The sun dipped low and painted everything gold before it sank behind the trees. By the time darkness settled, the woods were completely black, the kind of black that swallowed the shapes of the trees and even the cabin if I looked too far past the glow of the porch light. It was darker than the city ever got. Out there, once the light was gone, the night took everything with it. I tried to sleep, but it was harder than I expected. Every small sound carried through the cabin. The groan of the wood, the rustle of leaves outside, the distant snap of a branch. My mind latched onto each sound and tried to turn it into something. I told myself it was just animals, just the wind, just the house settling. Still, I tossed and turned for hours, never fully resting. The second day, I went for a walk deeper into the woods. The air was cool, the ground damp. I didn't see any trails, so I just picked a direction and kept walking. After a while, I came across something strange. A tree with deep cuts running along its trunk. They weren't natural. They were wide, uneven gashes, like someone had taken an axe to it. The cuts were fresh, the wood inside still pale. I stared at it for a while, trying to make sense of it. Maybe someone had been chopping firewood there. Maybe it was just nothing. Still, it stuck in my mind as I walked back. That night, I sat on the porch after dinner. The woods were quiet again, too quiet. The stillness was thick, pressing against my ears. Then, in the distance, I thought I heard something moving. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching over leaves. I sat up straighter, straining to hear. The sound stopped. I told myself it could have been a deer, maybe even a raccoon, but it hadn't sounded like an animal. It had sounded steady, heavy, like a person walking. I went inside, locked the door, and sat in the living room with the lights on. My heart wouldn't settle. I tried to distract myself by reading one of the books I had brought, but my eyes kept flicking toward the window. Every small creak of the cabin made my stomach tighten. When I finally crawled into bed, I left the lamp on beside me. The third day, I told myself I was being paranoid. People lived in the woods all the time. People camped, hunted, hiked. Maybe someone had been passing through. Maybe they had their own cabin nearby. I tried to brush it off. Still, I couldn't stop replaying the sound of those footsteps. That afternoon, I went out to gather firewood. As I walked past the side of the cabin, I noticed something on the ground. Footprints. They were faint, pressed into the soft dirt near the tree line. They were larger than mine and spaced out like someone with a long stride had walked there. They led toward the woods, but not from the road. It looked like whoever it was had come from behind the cabin, from deeper in the forest. A cold weight settled in my chest. Someone had been close, very close, close enough to stand at the edge of the trees and look at the cabin. I crouched down and traced one of the prints with my hand. It wasn't old, maybe a day or less. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sit outside. I locked every door, checked the windows twice, and sat with the lights on until exhaustion forced me to bed. Even then, I didn't sleep. I lay still, listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, this time closer. They circled the cabin, slow and careful. My throat tightened, and I held my breath. The steps paused near the back door. Then I heard the faint scrape of metal, like something brushing against the handle. I wanted to get up, to do something, but fear rooted me to the bed. After what felt like hours, the sound stopped. I didn't move until the sky outside began to lighten. By morning, I was shaking. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, searching for signs. The dirt around the back door was disturbed. Whoever had been there had tried the handle. They had stood just outside while I lay in bed. I kept asking myself why. Why come all the way out here? Why walk circles around a cabin in the middle of the night? The fourth day, I thought about leaving, packing up, driving down that dirt road, and forgetting the whole trip. But a stubborn part of me told me I was overreacting. Could have been some hunter, maybe even the owner checking on the place. But then I thought about the footprints, the noise at the door, and I knew deep down that wasn't it. That evening, I built a fire in the fireplace. The crackling made the cabin feel less empty. For a little while, I convinced myself everything was fine. But when the fire burned low and I went to the window, I thought I saw something. A figure just at the tree line, barely visible between the trunks. My chest went tight. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't sleep that night either. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something scrape against the wall. Then a dull thud, like a hand or shoulder pressing against the wood. My pulse pounded in my ears. Whoever it was, they were testing me, watching me. By the 5th day, I was exhausted. My eyes were red, my hands shaky. I knew I couldn't stay much longer. I had to decide. Either leave in daylight or risk whatever was waiting for me at night. I packed some of my things, ready to load them into the truck. But before I left, I went around the back of the cabin. That's when I saw it. A fresh carving in the wood siding, deep and jagged. It was a symbol of some kind. Not letters or words, just crude lines slashed into the wall. Whoever had been out there wanted me to know they had been close. They wanted me to see it. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my bag, threw it in the truck, and drove. The dirt road twisted and turned, branches scraping against the sides, but I didn't slow down. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles hurt. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone behind me. When I finally reached the main road, I didn't stop. I drove for hours, not breathing right until I saw the lights of a town. I pulled into a gas station, parked under the bright fluorescent lights, and sat there shaking. I never went back to that cabin. I never even contacted the owner. Couldn't. The memory of those nights, of the footsteps circling me, of the carved mark in the wood, it was enough to keep me away forever. I realized then that the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're people. People who choose to be out in the dark, watching, waiting, getting close enough to touch the walls of where you sleep. And you never know why. I had been planning that trip for months. The whole idea was to get away from everything for a while, cut off from work, the noise of the city, and all the endless stress that kept following me around no matter where I went. I thought a small cabin deep in the woods would give me the quiet I needed. I had booked the place through a private rental. It was old, isolated, and not even listed on most websites. The owner told me it had no cell service, no Wi-Fi, and that the nearest paved road was nearly 30 minutes away by a narrow dirt trail. That was exactly what I wanted. When I arrived, the late afternoon sun was cutting through the tall pines, making long shadows across the clearing. The cabin stood in the middle of that clearing. It looked small, square-shaped, made of old weathered logs with a rust-colored tin roof. There was a narrow porch with a wooden chair that looked like it hadn't been sat on for years. The windows were smudged and slightly warped with age. The place smelled like damp wood and pine needles. There was an outhouse about 30 yards away, hidden behind some brush. No neighbors, no other houses, nothing but trees pressing in from every side. I parked my truck just a few feet from the cabin. The dirt road was rough, and the undercarriage scraped against a rock when I pulled in. The engine ticked as it cooled in the silence. I carried my supplies inside: a cooler full of food, a sleeping bag, a duffel bag with clothes, a lantern, a small camping stove, and a first aid kit. Inside the cabin, the air was stale. Dust floated in the sunlight coming through the slanted blinds. The interior was bare, just a wooden table, 2 chairs, a shelf with some old paperbacks, and a narrow cot against one wall. The floor creaked under my boots. I set my things down and checked the place carefully. The windows latched properly. The door lock worked. Everything seemed fine, though the silence was heavier than I expected. Even outside, there were no distant sounds of cars, no voices, no signs of anyone. Only the occasional caw of a crow or the crack of a branch somewhere in the woods. First, it was peaceful. I made a simple meal on my camping stove, ate on the porch, and watched the sky turn orange and then purple as the sun dropped behind the tree line. The shadows grew longer, and soon the clearing was swallowed by darkness. The forest around me turned into a solid wall of black. I turned on my lantern inside the cabin and shut the door. The old wood popped and groaned as it cooled from the day's heat. That first night was harder than I thought it would be. I tried to sleep on the cot, but every sound outside kept me awake. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, the distant call of something moving through the woods. My mind kept painting pictures of what it could be. A bear, maybe. A deer. Something bigger. The thin walls of the cabin didn't feel like much protection. I finally drifted off sometime after midnight, waking up again at dawn with the gray light leaking in through the blinds. The morning was better. I made coffee on the stove and walked around the clearing. The forest floor was damp and soft under my boots, littered with pine cones and patches of moss. The air smelled fresh. I started to feel more comfortable, telling myself the first night was always the hardest when you're not used to a place. I spent most of that day hiking a narrow trail I found behind the cabin. It wound deeper into the woods, twisting through thick brush and patches of fallen logs. I lost track of time, and when I came back, the sun was already low again. That night was worse than the first. I had just shut off my lantern and was lying on the cot, trying to relax, when I heard it, a sound that didn't fit with the forest. Not an animal, not wind, not anything natural. It was faint at first, like a slow crunching of gravel, though there was no gravel anywhere near the cabin. My chest tightened as I lay still, listening. The sound came again, steps. Slow, steady, deliberate. The hairs on my arms rose. Someone was walking outside the cabin. I held my breath. My mind raced. Could have been a hunter passing through, or maybe just my imagination playing tricks. But the footsteps moved across the clearing, crunching lightly over the dirt and pine needles. They stopped near the porch. My pulse pounded so hard I thought it would echo in the silence. I stared at the ceiling in the dark, afraid to even shift my weight on the cot. The steps didn't continue. There was only silence. I waited, muscles tense, for what felt like an hour. Finally, I forced myself to move. I sat up slowly and clicked the lantern back on. The light filled the cabin with a weak yellow glow. Nothing outside the window. No shadows. No movement. I wanted to believe I had imagined it, but deep down I knew I hadn't. Sleep didn't come easy after that. Every creak of the old wood, every rustle of wind against the cabin made me jolt awake. When morning finally came, I felt heavy and drained. I went outside, searching the clearing for any sign of tracks, but the ground was covered in a mix of needles and leaves. Nothing clear, nothing I could be sure of. I told myself maybe it had been an animal, something big enough to sound like footsteps, maybe a black bear or even a moose. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling it had been human. That day, I stuck close to the cabin. I chopped some dead branches for firewood, reorganized my supplies, and kept scanning the tree line. The silence of the woods no longer felt peaceful. It felt like something was watching. By the time the sun dipped again, my nerves were raw. That night, I made sure the door was locked, even though the thin wood wouldn't have stopped anyone determined. I left the lantern on longer this time, afraid of the dark. Around midnight, the sound came again. This time it was clearer, closer, slower. Footsteps circling the cabin. My stomach dropped. They moved from one side to the other, stopping near the window. I could hear the faint crunch just feet from where I sat inside, frozen on the cot. I didn't move. My throat was dry, my palms sweaty. The steps lingered, shifting weight back and forth. Then silence. I stared at the window, but the blinds blocked my view. I was too afraid to lift them. Hours passed before I finally let myself drift into a shallow, restless sleep. When daylight came, I checked again. This time I did see faint impressions in the dirt near the porch. Not clear footprints, but enough to tell me something or someone had been there. The realization sank in heavy. Someone was out there, and they knew I was here. By the third night, my nerves were shot. I thought about leaving, packing up and driving back down that rough dirt road, but part of me was stubborn. I had wanted solitude, and I hated the idea of running away without knowing what was going on. I told myself maybe it was kids messing around, though that made no sense in such a remote place. Or maybe some hunter using the land without permission. That night, the footsteps came earlier, just after dark. This time, they didn't just circle. They came right up to the porch. I heard the boards creak under the weight. My heart slammed in my chest. Then slow scraping at the door. Not knocking, not banging, scraping like fingers or something metal dragging lightly against the wood. I sat frozen, gripping the edge of the cot, staring at the door. The scraping went on for a few seconds, then stopped. I stayed awake the entire night, lantern burning, eyes fixed on the door. The sound never came back, but I couldn't shake the thought of someone standing just outside in the dark, waiting. By morning, I had made up my mind. I had to leave. The peace I had come for was gone, replaced with a steady knot of fear that tightened every time the sun went down. I packed my things quickly, stuffing everything into my truck. When I climbed in and started the engine, relief washed over me. I turned down the dirt road, the cabin shrinking behind me in the rearview mirror. But a few minutes down the road, I saw something that froze my blood, a shape hanging from a tree limb over the trail. I slowed, heart pounding, as I realized what it was. My own lantern, the same one I had left burning inside the cabin that morning. It swayed gently from a branch, tied there with a strip of fabric that looked like it had been torn from my sleeping bag. My hands shook on the wheel. Someone had gone into the cabin after I left. They had been inside. They wanted me to know it. I didn't stop. I didn't look closer. I pressed the accelerator, bouncing hard over rocks and ruts, the truck shuddering as I tore down that narrow trail until I reached the paved road. I didn't breathe easy until the cabin was miles behind me. Later, when I told people about it, some shrugged and said it must have been squatters or kids. But I knew it was more than that. Whoever had been there wasn't just passing through. They had been watching me from the start, circling the cabin, waiting, studying. They had walked around me while I lay frozen inside, not knowing what to do. The thought that stuck with me the most wasn't the footsteps or the scraping at the door. It was the lantern. They had been inside, close enough to touch my things, close enough to take something of mine and hang it like a warning. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. I had been planning the trip for months, and by the time the week came, I felt like I needed it more than anything. My head had been full for too long, too many days in the city, too much noise, too many faces. I wanted silence. I wanted a break from glowing screens, endless notifications, and people breathing down my neck in crowded streets. That was why I had rented the cabin. It was small, old, and sitting far back in the woods near a lake that I had only seen in pictures online. The place was advertised as quiet and isolated, with no neighbors in sight, no busy roads, and no one to bother me. That was exactly what I wanted. I left early in the morning, driving for hours through long stretches of highway, then onto smaller roads until the pavement ended and I was rolling down gravel, trees leaning over the sides. The cabin was several miles off the main road, and by the time I pulled into the clearing, my car coated in dust, I felt the air already change. It was cooler, calmer, and smelled like pine and damp dirt. The cabin itself was simple. One floor, wood walls, small porch, a stone chimney, and a tin roof that looked old but solid. The inside was basic, wooden floor, one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a sitting area with a couch that had seen better days. The windows were narrow but opened wide enough to let the air in. No TV, no internet, no phone service. There was a small radio, but that was it. When I set my bags down inside, I felt relieved. I thought to myself that this was going to be good. I would hike, read, maybe fish, and just be away from everything. The first day was quiet. I unpacked, cleaned a little, walked down to the lake. It was bigger than I thought. The water dark but calm, surrounded by thick forest on all sides. The surface was smooth like glass, only broken when a fish jumped or when wind ran across it. I sat there for a while, watching. The stillness was what I had wanted, and I felt at peace. That night, I built a fire in the small pit outside. I sat watching the flames crack and spit, listening to the forest around me. I could hear insects, the call of some bird far off, and once in a while, the quick rustle of something moving through the underbrush. Nothing unusual. I stayed out until the fire turned to glowing coals. Then I went inside. The cabin was colder than I expected, so I kept the fire in the wood stove going. Laying in bed, I listened to the faint sounds outside. The creaking of trees in the wind, the occasional hoot of an owl, the tap of branches against the cabin walls. It was strange at first, but not unpleasant. Eventually, I drifted off. The second day, I woke up early, made coffee, and took a walk deeper into the woods. The trail wasn't marked, but the trees were spaced enough that I could move through them easily. The air was crisp, the ground soft with old leaves and pine needles. After walking for maybe an hour, I came across what looked like an old hunting blind nailed into the branches of a tree. It looked abandoned, weathered by time, and I moved on without thinking much of it. The rest of the day passed slow. I read, cooked simple food, walked to the lake again, and just sat. Felt good to be away. But that night was different. I had just settled into bed when I thought I heard something outside. It was faint, like a crunch of leaves. I told myself it was probably an animal. There were deer in these woods, maybe raccoons. But as I lay there, I kept hearing it, slow steps, not quick like an animal running, but steady, dragging at times. The sound circled the cabin, soft but noticeable in the silence. I stayed still in bed, trying not to breathe too loud. The steps stopped after a while, but by then, my chest was tight and my hands damp. I told myself it was nothing, maybe the wind playing tricks. Still, I barely slept. The morning came gray and damp. I went outside to check around the cabin. I looked for tracks but didn't see much. The ground near the porch was hard-packed dirt, so nothing showed. I brushed it off and told myself I was being paranoid. But the feeling stayed with me. Later that day, I walked to the lake again, trying to shake it off. The water was calm, the forest quiet, but I felt watched. It was like eyes were on me, though I couldn't see anyone. Every time I turned, the trees looked the same, thick and endless. I didn't stay long. That night, I made sure the doors were locked and the shutters closed. The cabin only had one lock on the front door, a simple latch, but I slid a chair under the knob as well. I went to bed but stayed awake listening, and the steps came again. This time they were clearer, closer, circling slow. I could hear twigs snapping, leaves crunching. My throat felt dry, my body tense. Whoever or whatever it was, they were outside my cabin, moving in the dark. I stayed still, every sound sharp in my ears. After what felt like hours, the steps stopped again. The morning sun felt like a relief. I went outside, checked again, but still no clear tracks. Only disturbed leaves here and there, which could have been anything. But deep down, I knew it wasn't nothing. By the fourth day, the silence no longer felt peaceful. Felt heavy. Every sound outside made me flinch. I barely left the cabin, only stepping out quick to grab firewood or water. The forest no longer looked calm. It looked endless and hiding things. That night, the steps came again, but this time they reached the porch. I heard the boards creak under weight, slow, pressing down. Then I heard a faint scrape against the door, like fingers or something brushing the wood. My chest pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. I held my breath, staring at the dark ceiling, waiting. The scrape came again, then stopped. After a long pause, the steps moved off, fading back into the woods. I didn't sleep at all. When morning came, I checked the porch. There were faint marks on the door, thin and shallow, like something had been dragged against it. I thought about leaving. My car was parked only a short walk away. I could pack up and go. But I told myself maybe it was just someone messing around, maybe a hunter passing by. I didn't want to admit I was scared, but that night proved it wasn't random. Started the same steps circling, slow and steady. But then I heard something at the window. Not a knock, not a scratch, but the faintest press, like weight leaning against the glass. I froze, staring at the window even though the shutters blocked the view. The sound stayed for a while, then shifted to the next window, then the next, moving around the cabin. It was clear now. Someone was out there, watching, testing. I didn't sleep. I stayed awake with a knife from the kitchen in my hand, waiting for the sound of glass breaking or the door giving in. But it never came. By morning, my mind was spinning. I decided I had to leave. I started packing my bag fast, shoving everything inside without care. I stepped out onto the porch, heart racing, eyes darting at every shadow. The forest was quiet, but I didn't trust it. When I got to my car, I saw it. The tires were slashed. All four. Long, deep cuts, rubber torn open. My chest went hollow. I stood there staring, trying to make sense of it. Someone had done this during the night. Someone wanted me stuck here. I couldn't drive. I couldn't leave. I walked back to the cabin, bag still in hand, feeling the weight of the woods pressing in. I locked the door, shoved furniture against it, and sat inside with my back to the wall. My mind ran through everything, how far the main road was, if I could hike there, if I would even make it without getting lost. The day dragged on. Every sound outside made me flinch. When night came, I kept the stove burning low, not wanting the light to draw attention. I sat with the knife again, waiting. The steps came as they always did. Slow, circling, steady. But now there was something else. A sound like breathing, faint but heavy, just beyond the walls. Then came the scrape at the door again, slow and deliberate. I stayed awake, every muscle tense, until the first light of dawn. I knew then I couldn't stay another night. I packed again, this time only essentials. A bottle of water, food, flashlight, knife. I decided I would hike out. The main road was miles away, but if I followed the path I had driven, I could make it. I stepped outside, scanning the trees. Everything was silent, too silent. I started walking fast, not looking back. The forest closed in around me, the trees tall and endless. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something behind me. Steps, faint but matching my pace. I didn't stop to check. I kept moving, faster and faster, heart pounding. Hours passed. My legs ached, my throat dry, but I pushed on. The road had to be close. But then I saw it. On the ground ahead, half hidden under leaves, was one of my own bags. The one I had left packed inside the cabin. It was sitting in the middle of the trail, unzipped with my clothes scattered. My chest went cold. Someone had been inside. Someone had moved it here ahead of me. I dropped it and ran. I had been looking forward to the cabin trip for months. It was supposed to be nothing more than a quiet break away from the noise of the city, a time where I could breathe in fresh air, chop wood, fish at the nearby lake, and sleep without hearing cars or sirens or the endless buzz of phones. The cabin itself belonged to a friend of mine who rarely used it anymore, and he let me have the keys without asking for anything in return. He had told me the place was basic, no internet, no TV, limited electricity, but that was exactly what I wanted. I craved silence and stillness, something life rarely offered me anymore. The cabin sat a good 2 hours down a dirt road from the nearest town. Driving there, I noticed how quickly the signs of civilization faded away. Gas stations, stores, and houses grew fewer until finally there were none at all. I reached a point where my phone showed no signal bars, and I realized I had entered a zone where, if anything happened, there would be no calling for quick help. I told myself that was part of the experience. I even felt a little proud, like I was about to prove to myself that I could handle isolation. When I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was dropping behind the trees. The cabin looked rough but sturdy. Dark wooden walls, a stone chimney, and a roof that had clearly taken a beating from years of weather. The porch creaked as I walked up the steps, and the railing was loose, but inside it was clean enough. A single room made up most of the space, with a small kitchen area, a wood stove, a narrow bed against one wall, and a table with 2 chairs. In the corner, there was a locked storage cabinet where my friend said he kept tools, lanterns, and backup supplies. The first night was peaceful. I cooked a simple meal, lit a lantern, and read a paperback until my eyes grew heavy. Outside, the forest was silent except for the occasional crack of branches or the faraway hoot of an owl. It took me longer than usual to fall asleep because the silence felt so heavy, but eventually I drifted off. The second day passed quietly too. I collected firewood, checked out the lake, and even managed to catch a small fish. By the time I cooked it for dinner, I was feeling proud of myself. The quiet no longer felt strange, felt good. That night, I went to bed early, the kind of sleep you only get after a day outdoors. It was on the third night that things started to change. I woke suddenly, not sure what had disturbed me. The cabin was dark except for the faint red glow of the embers in the stove. I stayed still, listening. Then I heard it, faint but clear. The sound of footsteps outside, crunching on the ground. Slow, steady, deliberate. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer, but the steps didn't sound like hooves. They sounded like a person walking. My chest tightened as I held my breath. The steps moved along the side of the cabin, paused, and then circled toward the back. The ground was covered with dry leaves and small sticks, and each step snapped and cracked. Whoever or whatever it was heavy enough to break twigs underfoot. I waited for a knock or for the sound to fade away, but neither happened. The steps stopped near the back window. I stared at the darkness, waiting for a shadow to pass, but the window stayed black. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would echo through the wood walls. Finally, after what felt like forever, the steps moved again, this time away from the cabin and into the woods. I stayed frozen in bed until exhaustion pulled me back into a shallow, restless sleep. The next morning, I went outside. The air was crisp and cold. I walked around to the back of the cabin, and my stomach dropped. In the dirt just below the window, there were footprints. Human footprints. They were large, too larger than mine, pressed deep into the earth as if from someone heavy. The tracks wandered toward the trees before disappearing in the undergrowth. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe a hiker had gotten lost. Maybe it was some hunter passing through. But what kind of hiker walked around someone else's cabin in the middle of the night without saying anything? My nerves stayed raw the rest of the day. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the wood, every pop from the stove made me tense. I didn't hear footsteps again, but I couldn't shake the thought of someone being out there. On the fifth night, the noises returned. This time, instead of footsteps, I heard the faint metallic sound of the porch door handle rattling. My mouth went dry instantly. I sat upright in bed, staring into the dark. The rattling came again, harder this time, as if someone was testing it, seeing if it would give. I had locked it earlier, thank God. After a long minute, the rattling stopped. Then silence. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. On the porch, pressed into the dust on the wooden boards, was the clear outline of a hand. A large, dirty handprint. It was smeared like whoever left it had been leaning heavily against the door, pushing, testing the lock. I told myself I needed to leave, but the dirt road back was long and rough. My car wasn't the best, and if it broke down out there, I'd be stranded with no cell signal. I figured it was safer to stay put, at least for one more night, and then head out at first light. But that night was the worst of them all. I had locked the door, bolted the windows, and kept the lantern burning low. I lay in bed, wide awake, listening to the sounds outside. Hours passed. At some point, exhaustion overtook me and I drifted off. Then a sound yanked me awake. A slow, steady scrape against the wall. Metal on wood. My skin crawled instantly. It sounded like a knife dragging across the cabin's siding. The scrape moved slowly along the wall, circling the cabin, inch by inch. I sat frozen, clutching the blanket, my heart pounding so hard I thought my chest would burst. The scraping lasted a long time before stopping. Then came the footsteps again, right outside the window, so close I could almost feel the weight of them through the wall. I forced myself to stay quiet, not moving, not even breathing heavily. I knew if I made a sound, whoever was out there would know I was awake. Eventually, the sounds faded into the distance. When daylight came, I stepped outside with shaking hands. My stomach dropped when I saw what had been done. Deep, jagged scratches ran along the cabin walls, circling the entire building. They were uneven, ugly, carved deep into the wood by something sharp. Whoever had done it hadn't been trying to break in that time. They had been marking the cabin. That was it for me. I packed my bag fast, barely taking time to put things in order. I loaded the car and started down the dirt road as fast as I dared. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone stepping out of the trees behind me. The drive back felt endless, but eventually I reached the paved road and then the edge of town. When I finally saw other cars, gas stations, and people, I felt a weight lift from my chest. I knew I wasn't safe until I left those woods far behind. Later, when I told my friend about the scratches and footprints, he just looked at me quietly and said the cabin had always made him uneasy. He admitted he rarely stayed there because he'd heard things at night too, though never anything as bad as what I described. He offered to go check it out himself, but I told him not to. I never went back to that cabin. Even now, thinking about it makes my skin crawl. The heavy footsteps in the night, the rattling handle, the handprint on the porch, the sound of a knife dragging slowly across the walls. Whoever was out there, they weren't lost. They weren't looking for shelter. They knew I was inside, and they were playing with me, testing me, waiting, and I'll never know why. I had rented the cabin because I wanted time away from everything. My head was full of noise, and I felt like the city was eating me alive. The small cabin was in the middle of thick woods about 2 hours off the main road, a place that promised quiet and stillness. The rental site had shown a few pictures. A wooden porch, one small window, a fire pit outside, and a dirt trail leading down to a lake. I thought it would be peaceful. The drive out had already felt unsettling. The paved road had given way to a gravel track, and the gravel track had thinned into two muddy ruts lined with tall trees. The branches leaned overhead, shutting out most of the light, and the air grew heavy as if even sound had trouble moving through it. My car bounced over roots and stones, and I remember thinking that if it broke down out there, no one would find me for days. When I finally reached the cabin, I was struck by how alone it felt. No cell signal, no other houses, no sign of people at all. The place looked older than in the photos, with dark logs and a roof that sagged slightly in the middle. The windows were dusty, the porch steps creaked, and the air smelled like wet wood and earth. It was early evening, and I had to force myself to unload the car quickly before the last light went down. Inside was simple: a single room with a bed pushed against the wall, a table with two chairs, a shelf with some old canned goods, and a wood stove in the corner. There was no electricity. I had brought lanterns, food, and water, so I felt prepared, but I also felt something else. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was thick, almost hostile, like the trees pressed in against the walls. Every sound I made echoed too loudly. The first night was long. I lay in bed, listening. I thought I would hear crickets or owls, but the woods were strangely quiet. Every so often, though, I thought I heard faint cracks of branches, the soft press of something moving through leaves. At first I told myself it was deer, maybe raccoons, but it didn't stop. The noises would come, then silence, then another noise in a different spot. Felt like something circling. By morning, I convinced myself I was only nervous. I made coffee on a small camping stove, ate a quick breakfast, and tried to settle in. I chopped some wood for the stove, carried water from the lake, and tried to read. During the day, things felt more normal. The light softened the edges of the trees, and the lake shimmered through gaps in the branches. I even thought maybe the night noises had just been my imagination. That second night, I realized it wasn't my imagination. I had turned in early, lantern turned low, wrapped in my sleeping bag. Again, the silence of the woods pressed against the cabin walls, and again, I heard the noises. At first, just faint steps, almost dragging. Then a clear crack, like someone stepping on a stick. I held my breath, trying to pinpoint it. The sound circled slowly around the cabin, stopping, starting again, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. I stared at the ceiling for hours, eyes wide, listening to something move where no one should be. By morning, I was exhausted. I checked outside. No footprints in the dirt. No broken branches I could see. I tried to laugh at myself, but unease dug deeper into me. I had 3 more nights booked, and part of me wanted to leave, but pride kept me there. I didn't want to admit I was scared. On the 3rd day, I walked deeper into the woods to distract myself. The trees were endless, thick trunks rising straight up, blocking the sky. After a while, I noticed small things that didn't feel right. A patch of ground where the leaves had been scraped away. A tree with bark peeled off low to the ground. A half-burned log that looked like it had been dragged. These things could have been natural, but together they made my stomach tighten. I hurried back to the cabin before dark. That night was worse. The noises started earlier, before I had even gone to bed. Slow, careful steps, then silence, then more steps. I was sure it wasn't an animal anymore. Animals don't walk in circles around a cabin, pausing as if listening. At one point, I thought I heard breathing, heavy and wet, just beyond the thin walls. My mouth went dry. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would shake the bed. I gripped the small hatchet I kept by the stove and didn't sleep at all. By morning, my decision was clear. I had to leave. My nerves were frayed, and the thought of one more night was unbearable. I packed quickly, throwing everything into bags, shoving food into boxes. I loaded the car, glancing constantly at the tree line. The woods felt wrong, like they were watching me. When I tried to start the car, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again. Nothing. My hands shook as I turned the key over and over, but the car refused to start. I cursed out loud and sat frozen, realizing I was stuck. The nearest town was miles away down that dirt track. Walking it might take half a day, maybe more, but sitting there waiting felt worse. I decided to stay one more night, leave at first light, and hike out. That day crawled by. I sat on the porch, gripping the hatchet, scanning the woods. I thought I saw movement once or twice, just quick flickers between trees, but when I stared, nothing was there. My skin prickled constantly, every hair on my arms standing up. I barely ate. I barely moved. I waited for night with dread. The last night was the longest of my life. The noises came back, louder, more deliberate, circling, stopping, starting again. At one point, something brushed against the wall with a dull scrape. I froze, holding my breath, my knuckles white around the hatchet. Hours passed like that, my body stiff, my mind screaming at me to run. Couldn't. There was nowhere to go in the dark. When dawn finally broke, I left. I grabbed my pack, stuffed water and a little food inside, and walked. I didn't look back at the cabin. I didn't want to see if something was watching from the trees. I kept my eyes on the dirt track, one step after another, heart hammering, every sound in the woods making me flinch. After hours of walking, I reached the main road. A truck eventually came by, and I flagged it down. I didn't explain much. I didn't have the words. I just knew I couldn't go back. Later, when I thought about it, I realized the worst part. The ground around the cabin had shown no tracks because whoever had been there knew how to move without leaving them. They had circled me for nights, just beyond thin wooden walls, waiting, watching, and I would never know who they were or what they wanted. That thought stayed with me. Not the silence, not the noises, but the fact that someone had been there, patient and careful, close enough to touch the cabin walls, while I lay inside pretending I was safe. And I realized something else. If my car had started that morning, I might never have seen the faint shape standing at the edge of the trees when I walked away. I caught it only once, between the trunks, a still figure that didn't move as I left. Whoever it was had let me go. I had been waiting for months to finally get away from the noise of the city. Life had been draining me for years. The endless sounds of traffic, people rushing everywhere, the constant stress of work, and the feeling that there was never a place to breathe. When I found the listing for a small, old cabin deep in the woods, I felt like I had discovered something rare. It was simple, nothing fancy, just a wooden cabin near a lake, miles from the nearest town. There was no internet, no television, no neighbors within sight. It sounded like the perfect escape. I drove there in my truck with a week's worth of supplies. The road got smaller and rougher the closer I got, until it turned into little more than a dirt trail. Tall trees surrounded me, closing in on both sides, their branches hanging low. The forest looked untouched, thick, and quiet in a way that almost felt unnatural after so long in the city. By the time I finally saw the cabin through the trees, I felt a wave of relief. It stood there in a clearing, dark brown wood with a sloped roof and a stone chimney. The windows looked dusty, and the porch sagged slightly, but it seemed solid enough. When I stepped out of the truck, the air was sharp and cool, filled with the smell of pine and damp earth. There were no voices, no cars, no hum of electricity, just the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I unloaded my things and carried them inside. The cabin smelled old, like wood that had been sitting through decades of seasons. Dust floated in the sunlight coming through the windows, and the floorboards creaked under my boots. Inside, it was simple. One main room with a small kitchen area, a wood stove, a table, and a bed pushed against the far wall. A single door led to a tiny bathroom with a pump sink. It was exactly what I had wanted: bare, quiet, and far away from everything. The first couple of days went by peacefully. I woke up early with the sunlight cutting through the trees and went for long walks down the trails around the cabin. I fished at the lake, sat on the porch reading, and cooked simple meals on the stove. At night, I built fires and listened to the crackle while outside the forest shifted with unseen movement. Sometimes I heard owls, sometimes the brush of animals in the undergrowth. At first, the sounds of the woods at night made me tense, but after a while I got used to it. I reminded myself that animals were just part of this place, and they weren't interested in me. It wasn't until the fourth night that something started to feel different. I was sitting at the table, finishing a late dinner, when I heard what sounded like a heavy step outside. It was faint, but sharp enough to make me stop chewing and freeze in place. I waited, listening hard, thinking maybe it was a deer or a bear. The woods were full of them, after all. But the sound came again, slow and deliberate, like a boot on dry ground. My stomach tightened as I realized it wasn't the random movement of an animal. It was the careful step of someone walking. I sat perfectly still, the fork in my hand halfway to my mouth. The air inside the cabin felt heavy. Whoever it was didn't come onto the porch. I just heard a couple more steps near the edge of the clearing, then nothing. After maybe 5 minutes, I forced myself to move, closing the curtains on the windows and locking the door even though I knew it was flimsy. I stayed awake for hours that night, lying in bed, listening for any more sounds. The forest seemed louder than ever, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves putting me on edge. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been an animal, but when I stepped outside, I found something that unsettled me deeply. In the dirt near the edge of the clearing were footprints. They weren't mine. I hadn't walked over there since arriving, and they were too large to belong to anyone else I knew. They looked fresh, pressed deep into the ground from the weight of a grown man. I crouched and stared at them, my chest tightening as I counted at least 6 prints leading out of the tree line and then circling toward the cabin before turning back the way they came. Whoever it was had come close, watched, and then left. I spent most of that day on edge. I couldn't relax like I had before. Every time I went inside, I found myself checking the windows, glancing toward the trees. I kept wondering who had been out there, why they had come so close, and why they hadn't made themselves known. In a place this remote, it didn't make sense. There weren't hikers wandering these woods, and the cabin wasn't near any main trail. The thought that someone had been standing there, watching me, filled me with a sense of unease I couldn't shake. That night, I made sure the fire was out early and turned off all the lamps. I sat in the dark, straining my ears, waiting. Hours went by, the forest shifting with its usual sounds, until I started to drift. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it again. A slow, deliberate step on dry leaves. Then another. My heart slammed in my chest as I sat up in bed. The footsteps came closer, not rushing, not trying to be loud, just steady, one at a time. Then they stopped. I stared at the dark ceiling, my body stiff, my ears ringing with the silence. After what felt like forever, I heard the faint creak of the porch steps. Someone was outside the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The boards of the porch gave one long groan as weight shifted on them. I pictured a man standing just beyond the door, his face inches from the thin wood, listening for me the way I was listening for him. I stayed frozen until eventually, after minutes of stillness, I heard the steps again, retreating slowly across the porch and back into the trees. When daylight finally came, I went outside again. More prints, clearer this time. They went up the porch, right to the front door, then turned back into the woods. I stared at them for a long time, my skin cold despite the morning sun. From then on, I couldn't relax for a second. I kept the curtains drawn and the door locked, though I knew a determined person could break through either without much effort. I thought about leaving, packing everything back into the truck and driving out, but something in me resisted. Part of it was stubbornness, part of it was the thought that maybe I was overreacting. But deep down, I think I stayed because I wanted to know who it was. I didn't want to leave without understanding what was happening. The following nights were worse. Every time the sun went down, I felt the weight of dread pressing down on me. I barely slept, listening for the sounds that always came. The footsteps returned, sometimes circling the cabin, sometimes lingering near the porch. I stopped lighting fires or using lamps at night, sitting in the dark so it would look like nobody was home. Even then, I sometimes thought I could hear breathing just outside the window, faint but unmistakable. On the 7th night, I reached a breaking point. I sat at the table with my hunting knife in front of me, staring at the door, waiting. I don't know how long I stayed like that, the minutes crawling by. Then I heard it. The steps again, but this time they were different. Quicker, more urgent. Before I could even stand, There was a sudden hard rattle at the door handle. Someone was trying to open it. My whole body surged with adrenaline as I grabbed the knife. The door shook once, then again harder. The wood creaked under the force. I stood there in the dark, holding my breath, gripping the handle of the knife so tight it cut into my skin. After a few seconds, the rattling stopped. Silence fell again. Then I heard retreating steps, fading back into the forest. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat awake until the sun came up, every muscle in my body tense. The next morning, I made my decision. I packed my things as quickly as I could and loaded them into the truck. I didn't care anymore if I ever found out who it was. I just wanted to get out. Before leaving, I walked one last time to the tree line, scanning the ground. The prints were everywhere, circling the cabin again and again. I couldn't tell how many times the person had been there, only that it had been often. As I climbed into the truck, I felt a mix of fear and relief. The engine roared to life, loud in the silent clearing. I drove down the dirt road, the trees swallowing the cabin behind me. The deeper into the forest I went, the more I felt like I was escaping something I wasn't meant to encounter. When I finally reached the paved road hours later, I stopped and sat in the truck, breathing hard. I looked back once at the direction I had come from, the endless wall of trees, and felt a chill run through me. Whoever had been out there in the woods watching me night after night, they were still there. I never went back to that cabin. I had been driving most of the afternoon, the tires of my old truck humming against the narrow two-lane road that wound deeper and deeper into the hills. The sun was slipping lower, streaking the sky with dull orange and purple shades, and the trees on both sides of the road grew thicker as I went further in. I had rented the small cabin for a week, a place I found through a listing online that promised peace, quiet, and nothing but forest around. That was exactly what I thought I wanted. I had been carrying too much stress for too long, and being away from everything seemed like the cure I needed. By the time I reached the dirt road that led to the cabin, the air had turned colder. The gravel cracked and shifted under my tires, dust rising up behind me as I drove slowly over the uneven track. Branches stretched overhead, closing me in like a tunnel. After a few minutes, the trees opened slightly, and I saw the cabin sitting back from the road. It was small, made of weathered wood that looked gray in the fading light. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and the porch leaned just enough to notice. It wasn't the neat little vacation cabin I had pictured in my head, but I told myself it would do. It was quiet, hidden, and far from people. That was enough. I parked near the side, shut off the engine, and listened. It was silent except for the ticking of the cooling motor and the faint whisper of wind moving through the treetops. No traffic, no voices, nothing man-made. Just empty air and the steady weight of the woods pressing in from all sides. I grabbed my bag, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The smell of old wood and dust hit me immediately. The air was colder in there than it was outside, and the floor creaked under my boots. The cabin was one room with a small kitchen area, a narrow bed pushed against the wall, a table with 2 chairs, and a stone fireplace that had black soot stains climbing up the chimney. There was a single window by the bed and another beside the door, both covered with thin curtains that looked like they hadn't been washed in years. I set my bag down, walked across the creaking floorboards, and checked the kitchen. There was a small gas stove, a rusty sink, and a half-broken cabinet with a few chipped plates and cups inside. I had brought food with me, so I wasn't worried about that. There was also a stack of firewood near the fireplace, which gave me some comfort since the cold was settling in quickly. After a quick check around the place, I locked the door and went outside again to bring in the rest of my things from the truck. The sun had slipped almost completely behind the ridge by then, and the trees looked darker, their shadows stretching long across the clearing. I carried in my supplies, stacked them neatly by the kitchen, and started a small fire in the fireplace to drive out the chill. The first night went by quietly. I sat at the table eating from a can, listening to the wood pop in the fire and the occasional thump of something falling out in the woods. It wasn't unusual for branches or pine cones to drop, but in that silence each sound carried like a warning. I told myself it was normal, just the forest moving in its own way. When I finally lay down on the bed, the mattress sagged under my weight and smelled faintly of mildew. It wasn't comfortable, but I was tired enough to drift off. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. The fire had burned low, and the room was dark except for the faint glow of embers. What woke me wasn't a dream or any sound inside the cabin. It was something outside. At first I thought it was the wind, but as I lay there, holding my breath, I heard it again. Footsteps. Not the scattered, uneven noise of a deer or small animal. These were slow, heavy steps that crunched the leaves in a steady rhythm. They moved around the cabin, one side, then the back, then pausing near the window. I lay perfectly still, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The steps stayed there for a long moment, then slowly drifted away into the woods. I didn't move until the first gray light of morning showed through the curtains. When I finally got up, I went outside and walked around the cabin. The ground was soft from old leaves and damp soil. I found marks where someone had stepped, the heel and toe prints clear in the dirt. They weren't mine. They were larger and deeper. They circled the cabin once, then disappeared back into the trees. My stomach turned as I stared at them, realizing someone had been there in the night, moving slowly, close enough to touch the walls if they wanted to. I told myself maybe it was a hunter or someone lost, but I knew that didn't explain why they circled me in the dark. The second day dragged by. I couldn't shake the thought of those steps, and I caught myself glancing at the window every few minutes as if someone would be standing there. I tried to keep busy, cooking a meal, splitting some of the wood, and walking a little way down the dirt road. But each time I stopped, the silence of the forest pressed harder. The kind of silence that wasn't just empty, it was waiting. I cut the walk short and returned, locking the door and keeping the fire going even in daylight. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake on the bed, staring at the dark ceiling, waiting. It was sometime after midnight when I heard it again. The steps, slower this time, deliberate. They stopped near the porch, then the wood groaned under weight. Someone was standing on it. My mouth went dry. I heard the faint scrape of fingers over the door, then silence. My body locked up, and I couldn't move. Minutes dragged like hours, and eventually the steps moved off again, fading into the woods. I stayed awake until the pale light of morning returned, and when I finally dared to open the door, I saw more prints in the dirt. They led up the steps, across the porch, and right to the door. I spent the whole morning pacing the cabin, trying to decide what to do. The place was too far from town to leave on foot, and the truck was my only way out. I told myself I should pack and leave right away, but part of me kept hesitating. I had paid for the week, and leaving early seemed ridiculous. Maybe it was just some local person messing around. Still, when night came, I stacked chairs against the door, shoved the table under the window, and kept the fire burning high. I sat with my back against the wall, clutching the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, listening. The hours crawled by. Each time the fire popped, I jumped. Around 2 in the morning, the sound came again. Steps circling, paused by the window, a shadow moving against the thin curtain. I gripped the poker so hard my hands hurt, but I didn't move. I waited until the sound faded again. My nerves were so tight that I didn't close my eyes until morning. The next day, I finally admitted I couldn't stay. I packed my bag, loaded it into the truck, and tried to start the engine. Coughed once, sputtered, then died. I tried again. Nothing. I checked under the hood, but I'm no mechanic. The wires looked fine, the fuel gauge wasn't empty. But no matter what I did, the truck wouldn't start. I walked around it and found something that turned my stomach cold. The tires had been slashed. Deep cuts in the rubber, all 4 of them. My heart raced as I stood there, the realization crashing down. Whoever had been outside the cabin wasn't just wandering. They wanted me trapped here. I hurried back inside, locked the door, and shoved the furniture back into place. My mind ran in circles. I had no phone service this deep in the woods, no radio, nothing to call for help. The road was long and twisting, miles of forest between me and the main highway. If I left on foot, I'd be exposed the entire way. Whoever was out there could follow me easily. The cabin was the only shelter I had, even though staying in it felt like sitting in a trap. The following nights blurred together. Each time, the steps returned, sometimes closer, sometimes lingering. Once, I heard the porch boards groan for nearly an hour straight, like whoever it was stood just outside the door, waiting. Another night, I woke to the faint sound of the doorknob turning back and forth. I held the poker and prayed the lock would hold. By the fourth night, I hadn't really slept in days. My nerves were frayed, my body weak from constant fear. I rationed my food and water, eating only enough to keep going. On the sixth day, the firewood ran low. I had to go outside. The pile was stacked near the treeline, and every step I took out there felt like a risk. The woods were silent, too silent. I carried the wood in quickly, but as I reached the porch, I noticed something. A shape nailed into the side of a tree. I walked closer and felt my chest seize up. It was a piece of cloth tied around a board, and on it was carved a rough shape of a human face. The eyes were hollow holes, and the mouth was a long, uneven slash. It hung there like a warning, swaying slightly in the breeze. My stomach turned, and I dropped the wood, stumbling back into the cabin. My hands shook as I bolted the door shut again. That night, the sounds came earlier. As soon as the sun went down, the steps circled. Then there was a loud, heavy thud against the wall, making the whole cabin shake. Another thud followed, then scraping sounds along the siding. I sat frozen in the dark, staring at the door, waiting for it to break open. Hours passed like that. I arrived at the cabin on a late afternoon in early autumn, when the air had that cool, dry edge that made the trees look sharper and the hills feel closer. The sky was pale blue with streaks of thin clouds, and the dirt road that wound up to the cabin was narrow and rough, with ruts that forced me to slow down and weave carefully. The cabin was tucked at the edge of a dense stand of pines, its dark roof half hidden under their branches, and the front porch tilted slightly as if it had been leaning for years. I had chosen it because it was cheap, remote, and I thought it would give me the quiet I wanted. I had convinced myself it would be a simple few days alone, just me and the woods, no one else around. The place smelled faintly of pine and old wood the moment I opened the door. Inside, it was darker than I expected, with one main room that held a small table, a wood stove, and a cot against the far wall. The boards of the floor creaked under my boots, and dust rose in the air every time I set something down. I unloaded my bag, set my lantern on the table, and walked through the rest of the cabin. There wasn't much else. Just a tiny room off the side that had shelves nailed into the walls, and a bathroom with a water pump that I wasn't sure even worked. The silence was what struck me the most. Out there, the world was stripped down to the sound of wind moving through trees, the occasional creak of the cabin as it shifted, and distant bird calls. No cars, no people, no constant hum of life that usually followed me everywhere. Just quiet. I thought it was perfect at first. I settled in quickly. I stacked the food I brought on the shelves, cans, bread, a few packets of dry noodles. I laid out my sleeping bag on the cot, knowing the thin mattress wouldn't be comfortable on its own. By the time I finished organizing, the sun was sliding lower, throwing long bars of orange light across the clearing outside the cabin. I stepped onto the porch and watched as the sky dimmed behind the treeline. The first night was uneventful. I lit the lantern, made a simple meal on a small gas stove I brought, and read a little until my eyes felt heavy. When I turned off the light, the darkness was complete. It felt like the walls of the cabin weren't enough to keep it out, and I had to focus on my breathing to stop from thinking about how alone I really was. Eventually, sleep pulled me under. The next morning, I woke early, around 6. The cold air in the cabin clung to me, so I pulled on a sweatshirt and stepped outside. Mist clung low in the clearing, and the trees stood tall and dark around me. I decided to walk the area just to get familiar. The trail I had driven in on stretched away downhill, and the woods pressed in tight on both sides. I followed it for a while, then turned off into the trees, weaving through them, listening to the crunch of leaves under my boots. The woods were dense. The ground dipped and rose, covered in patches of brush and fallen branches. It wasn't easy to walk, but I enjoyed it, at least at first. Every so often I stopped and listened, hearing the distant tap of a woodpecker or the flutter of wings. I pushed farther until I reached a ridge that overlooked a valley. From there, I could see rolling hills covered in endless trees, and not a single house, road, or sign of people. The view was both beautiful and a little unnerving. It drove home just how far away I was from anything. When I got back to the cabin, the sun was higher and the air was warmer. I spent the day splitting the small pile of firewood stacked against the side of the cabin, just to keep busy. I thought the days would drag, but they didn't. Time seemed to slip by quickly, with me moving from one small task to the next. I fixed a loose board on the porch, swept out the inside, checked the water pump, and found it only gave a trickle. That night, though, something felt different. When I laid down, I noticed faint noises outside. It sounded like branches snapping, slow and irregular, as if something large was moving through the trees near the clearing. At first I thought it might be a deer, but it kept going for longer than I liked. Each snap of a twig felt sharp in the silence. I stayed still, staring at the ceiling of the cabin, straining to hear. Eventually, it stopped. I told myself it was nothing, just an animal. The next morning, I walked the edge of the clearing. I found faint impressions in the dirt near the tree line. They looked like boot prints, though not very clear. I crouched down and ran my hand over them. They weren't mine. I hadn't walked there the day before. The soil was soft enough that anything heavy would leave a mark, and these looked fresh. I tried to tell myself it could have been an old hunter's prints, maybe someone who used the area months back. Still, the thought stayed with me all day. That night, I kept the lantern on longer than usual. I ate slowly, listening to every little creak of the cabin. Around midnight, I finally blew out the lantern and lay in the dark. Again, the noises came. This time it was clearer. Something moved around the clearing, slow, deliberate steps in the leaves. I held my breath and listened as they circled, closer to the porch this time. At one point, I heard the faint sound of the wooden step groaning, like weight had pressed against it. I didn't move. I stayed frozen under the blanket, heart hammering. After what felt like hours, the noises stopped again. I didn't sleep much after that. When morning came, I forced myself outside. I checked the porch, and sure enough, there was a smear of dirt on the edge of the step, like a boot had slid across it. My stomach tightened. Someone had been there. I spent the day on edge. I walked farther down the dirt road, thinking maybe I'd see another cabin or a sign of someone. But the road just wound deeper into the hills with no end in sight. I didn't see a soul. The emptiness of it all made the thought worse. If someone was watching the cabin, they were doing it for a reason. That night, I tried something different. I turned off the lantern earlier, lay down, and pretended to sleep. I kept my eyes half open, adjusting to the dark. The sounds started again, the same slow crunch of steps outside. This time, they lingered near the back of the cabin. I heard the scrape of something against the wall, faint but clear. Then silence. Minutes dragged by. My muscles ached from staying still. Suddenly, the faint sound of the door handle rattling reached me. Just once, then again, like someone testing it. I felt my throat go dry. I hadn't locked it earlier, so I got up as quietly as I could and slid the metal latch in place. My hands trembled. I stood there in the dark, waiting, listening. Whoever it was didn't try again. After a long stretch of silence, the noises faded into the trees. By morning, I was drained. I walked around the cabin and found fresh prints near the back wall. Clear this time, definitely boots. I counted at least 5 distinct ones. Whoever it was had circled close, maybe more than once. I spent the next day trying to keep busy, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I scanned the treeline, half expecting to see someone standing there. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. That night was the worst. I lay awake for hours, lantern off, waiting. The steps came again, closer, bolder. I heard them on the porch, slow, measured. Then the sharp creak of the wood as more weight pressed down. I stared at the door, watching the faint outline of it in the dark. The latch rattled harder this time, then silence. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. Minutes stretched, then I heard it, the faint scrape of metal like something thin sliding against the latch. Someone was trying to open it with a tool. I lunged forward and shoved my pack against the door, pressing my weight against it. The latch held, but I stayed there, frozen, every muscle tensed. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. Silence settled in again, but I didn't move. I stayed braced against the door until my legs ached. Eventually, the faint crunch of retreating steps moved away into the woods. When morning came, I knew I couldn't stay. Whoever it was, they were coming back each night, getting bolder. The cabin no longer felt like a shelter, it felt like a trap. I packed my things quickly, shoving them into my bag, barely caring about order. I loaded the car and started down the dirt road, checking the mirror every few seconds. The woods stayed silent, but the feeling didn't leave. The deeper I drove, the more I felt like someone was just out of sight, following, waiting. When I finally reached the paved road miles later, I didn't stop. I kept driving until the trees thinned and I saw the first sign of houses. I didn't go back to the cabin. I left it behind, the clearing, the porch, the prints in the dirt. I still don't know who it was out there, or why they circled the cabin night after night. Maybe it was just someone passing through, but the way they tested the door, the way they lingered, it felt like more than that. It felt like they were waiting for the right moment, and I wasn't going to give them one. I had been wanting a break from the city for months. The endless traffic, the noise, the crowded streets, and the constant rush had worn me down. When I finally got some time off work, I decided to spend it alone in a cabin. I booked a place far away, deep in the woods, where I could clear my head and just be by myself. The idea was simple: no phones, no internet, no people. Just me, the forest, and silence. The cabin I found was small and plain, nothing fancy, but it was in the kind of spot I wanted. It sat at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by thick trees on every side. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No cars, no voices, no machines. Just the occasional sound of birds in the distance and the wind moving through the branches. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. I carried my bags inside and looked around. The place was rustic with creaking wooden floors, a small kitchen, one bedroom, and a living room with a fireplace. There was no television, and the power came from a small generator behind the cabin. First, I felt calm. I unpacked slowly, set my things neatly, and walked around the cabin to check it out. Everything looked normal. The windows were old but clean, the furniture simple but enough. Outside, there was a small porch with 2 wooden chairs facing the trees. The woods around the cabin were dense, almost like a wall. The dirt road that brought me here was the only opening I could see. Beyond that, it was endless forest. The first day went quietly. I cooked myself a simple meal, walked around the area a little, and spent some time sitting outside, listening to the forest. I wanted peace, and I was getting it. As the sun set, the trees grew darker, and soon it was almost pitch black outside. I switched on a lamp inside and noticed how the glow barely reached the windows. Beyond the glass, there was only darkness. It felt strange, knowing that anything could be out there, and I wouldn't see it. But I told myself that was the point. I was here to escape the city, not to think about who or what might be outside. That night, I lay in bed and listened to the forest. At first, I heard crickets and the occasional owl. Then, as the night grew later, even those sounds seemed to fade. It was so quiet it almost felt heavy, like the silence pressed down on me. I drifted off, but at some point, I woke to a noise. It was faint, like something brushing against the wall of the cabin. I lay still, listening. It came again. A soft scraping sound, not steady, but enough to make me alert. I told myself it was just a branch moving in the wind. I closed my eyes and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to check. The trees stood still, and there wasn't much wind. I walked around the cabin slowly, looking at the walls. I didn't see anything at first, but near the back corner, the dirt looked disturbed, like something had moved across it during the night. I crouched down and saw faint impressions. Not clear enough to be sure, but they looked like footprints. Not animal prints, the shape was longer with a flat sole. Human. I stared at them for a while, trying to convince myself maybe I was imagining it, or maybe some hiker had wandered through. But the cabin was remote. The road ended here. There was no reason for someone to be walking around in the middle of the night. I shook it off. I told myself I was letting my mind run wild. I made breakfast, read a little, and tried to relax. But I found myself glancing at the windows more often, checking the tree line, listening for anything unusual. The day passed slowly, and I tried to enjoy it, but I couldn't forget the marks in the dirt. That evening, as the sun went down again, I felt uneasy. I locked the doors and double-checked the windows. When the darkness came, I sat in the living room with a lamp on and listened. Every creak of the cabin made me alert. Every gust of wind brushing the trees made me tense. I stayed up later than I meant to, just sitting in the chair, listening. Around midnight, I finally went to bed. It didn't take long before I woke again. This time, I knew it wasn't a branch. The sound was heavier, slower, like footsteps outside on the porch. The wood creaked faintly just once, then again. I lay frozen, heart racing. The cabin was small. Whoever was out there was only feet from me. I waited, not moving, barely breathing. After a long silence, I heard the faint sound of the porch step again, then nothing. When the morning came, I went outside to check. The porch had marks. The dust on the boards had been disturbed, clear enough to see the shape of shoes. Someone had been standing there. I walked the perimeter again, slower this time. Behind the cabin, in the soft dirt, there were more prints leading into the trees. They disappeared quickly into the forest, swallowed by leaves and undergrowth. My stomach sank. I was not imagining it. Someone had come in the night. I thought about leaving right then, but the nearest town was over an hour away, and I had no cell service this deep in the woods. The cabin was supposed to be safe. I told myself maybe it was nothing, maybe just some hunter passing through. But why stand on my porch in the middle of the night? Why walk around the cabin? I couldn't explain it, and that made it worse. The third night, I barely slept. I sat in the chair with a light on, staring at the door, waiting. Around the same time, close to midnight, I heard it again. Slow steps moving on the porch. This time, they didn't stop at one or two. They moved across, steady and unhurried, as if whoever it was knew I was inside. Knew I could hear them and didn't care. My chest tightened, and I gripped the armrests, staring at the door. The steps paused right outside, on the other side of the wood. I imagined a hand reaching for the knob, imagined the door pushing open. But it never did. After a long silence, the steps moved away, fading into the night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things quickly, stuffing them into my bag, ready to load up the car. When I stepped outside, I froze. On the porch, pressed into the dust, was a clear footprint. It was bare. No shoe, no boot. Just the shape of a human foot, long and thin, toes splayed, pointed directly at the door. I scanned the tree line, heart hammering, but saw nothing. The woods stood quiet, still as if watching. I grabbed my bags, threw them into the car, and started the engine. The dirt road felt endless as I drove out, every shadow between the trees looking like a figure. I didn't slow down until I reached the main road, and even then, I kept glancing in the mirror. By the time I reached town, I felt a wave of relief, but also a heavy weight in my stomach. I had wanted quiet and peace. Instead, I had spent 3 nights listening to someone walk around my cabin, waiting for me to let my guard down. I never went back, and even now, sometimes at night, when the world grows too quiet, I find myself listening again, remembering those footsteps on the porch, steady and patient, as if they could wait forever. I had been planning a quiet trip alone for months. Life in the city had been weighing me down, The noise, the traffic, the constant feeling that I could never find a moment of silence. So when I found a small cabin listing online, tucked away deep in the northern woods, far from town, I booked it without much hesitation. The pictures showed a simple wooden structure with a metal roof, a small porch, and trees stretching out in every direction. It looked old but solid, and most importantly, isolated. That was what I wanted. The drive out took most of the day. The last stretch of road wasn't even really a road, just a narrow dirt trail that twisted deeper into the forest. By the time I pulled up near the cabin, I felt like I had left the entire world behind. There were no other houses, no passing cars, no signs of people anywhere. Just endless trees, the wind sliding through their branches, and the crunch of gravel under my tires. The cabin sat on a small clearing with just enough space around it for the trees to fall back and give it light. It was plain and weathered, with a stone chimney on one side and a short set of steps up to the porch. Inside it was bare but comfortable enough. One main room with a wood stove, a bed pushed against the wall, a table, a couple of chairs, and a counter with some shelves. There was no electricity, no running water. Just lanterns, a pump outside, and a stack of wood already chopped. That suited me fine. I had brought enough food, water, and gear for a week. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked my things, set up my lanterns, and walked around the area to get a sense of the land. The woods were thick, the ground covered with pine needles and moss. A narrow path led off behind the cabin, winding deeper into the trees. I followed it for a while until it faded into nothing but undergrowth. The stillness of the place was heavy, like a blanket pressing down. At first it made me feel peaceful, but by nightfall it started to feel different, almost like the silence was listening back. That night, as I lay in bed with the lantern dimmed, I noticed every small sound. The creak of the wood stove cooling, the pop of the fire, the rustle of wind outside. I told myself it was just the forest doing what forests do, but my ears kept straining for something more. Eventually, I fell asleep. The second day, I kept busy. I cooked on the stove, read a book, and walked further into the woods. I wanted to clear my head, so I left the beaten path and wandered between the trees. I saw tracks here and there, probably deer or elk. A few broken branches showed where something larger had moved through not long ago. I wasn't worried about animals. I carried a small hatchet at my belt and had bear spray in my pack. By afternoon, I came across something that made me stop. About half a mile from the cabin, I found a small clearing. In the center was what looked like an old fire ring made of rocks, blackened from use. Around it were a few logs pulled up like seats. It looked abandoned but not ancient. The ashes in the ring weren't washed out by rain, which meant someone had used it recently. I crouched and touched the ground. It was dry, and when I brushed the ash, I found small pieces of half-burned wood still there. That unsettled me a little. I knew the cabin wasn't on any main campground. It was supposed to be far off from where hikers usually went. If someone had been out here, they had gone deep into the woods on purpose. I stood in the clearing for a while, scanning the trees. Everything looked normal. No tents, no gear, no trash. Just the faint smell of old smoke. I told myself it was probably hunters passing through. Still, I decided to head back. When I got to the cabin, I checked the locks even though I knew no one should be around. The door had a simple latch. The windows were small and had shutters that could be hooked from the inside. I made sure everything was shut tight before I lit the lanterns for the night. That night, I had a harder time sleeping. I woke up several times, certain I had heard something outside. Once it sounded like footsteps on the porch, but when I sat up and listened, all I could hear was the wind. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I stayed awake a long time, staring at the faint glow of the lantern and gripping the hatchet by the bed. Eventually, I dozed off again. The third day, I decided to walk back toward the fire ring. I wanted to prove to myself that it was nothing. But when I got there, I saw something new. Someone had been there again. The ashes were disturbed, and a fresh set of footprints circled the ring. They were boot prints, not animal. The tread was sharp, the edges not yet weathered. I stood there for a long time, my stomach sinking. Whoever it was, they had come back after I first found the place. They were out here in the same woods as me, maybe closer than I realized. I started to think about how far from help I really was. No phone service, no neighbors, just me and whoever else had chosen this place to camp. I turned back, moving quickly but trying not to look like I was running. Every sound behind me made me twitch. When I reached the cabin, I shut myself inside and sat at the table for hours, listening. The woods pressed in from every side, and the silence felt heavier than ever. That night, I barely slept. I thought I heard movement again, faint but real this time. A branch snapping, the crunch of leaves. I held my breath, straining to hear. Then silence again. I stayed awake with the hatchet across my lap until the sky lightened. The fourth day, I thought about leaving. I had brought enough fuel to make it back without trouble. But part of me didn't want to panic over nothing. Maybe it was just some hunter moving through. Maybe he had already left. I tried to calm myself. Still, I decided to check around the cabin in daylight. I walked the clearing in a slow circle. That was when I saw the prints. They were faint but clear enough in the soft ground. Boot prints, leading up toward the cabin and then back into the trees. They weren't mine. The size was larger, the tread different. My chest tightened. Someone had come right up close, maybe while I was inside. Maybe while I was asleep. I couldn't deny it anymore. I wasn't alone out here. That evening, I stacked furniture against the door. I checked the windows again and hooked the shutters tight. I kept the lantern low and sat in the dark most of the night, listening. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. This time I knew it was real. Slow, careful steps circling the cabin. The faint creak of the porch boards. My hands shook as I gripped the hatchet. The footsteps lingered for a while, then faded into the woods. I stayed awake until morning, my eyes burning, my ears ringing with the silence after. On the fifth day, I made my decision. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things, loaded my pack, and carried it to the truck. But when I got there, my stomach dropped. The truck was sitting with one tire slashed, the rubber flat and torn open. Someone had been there. Someone had made sure I couldn't leave. I stood frozen for a long time, my mind spinning. I had no spare tire. I had no way of calling for help. My only option was to try walking out, but the nearest town was miles away through rough forest. I went back to the cabin, shut the door, and tried to think. My food and water would last a while, but the thought of staying made my skin crawl. Whoever was out there knew I was here. They had walked right up to the cabin. They had cut the tire. They weren't just passing through. That night was the worst. I barely let the lantern burn at all. I sat in the dark, every muscle tense, waiting. And sure enough, the sounds came again. Slow steps around the clearing, stopping, starting again. A faint scrape against the wall. The door latch rattling softly, like someone testing it. My breath caught in my throat. I sat there gripping the hatchet, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. After what felt like hours, the sounds faded again. But I knew they would come back. The sixth day, I forced myself to prepare. If I stayed, I would lose. Whoever it was had the advantage. They could wait me out, circle the cabin as long as they wanted. My only chance was to leave on foot and make it to the road. I packed only what I could carry quickly: water, some food, the hatchet, and the bear spray. I waited until afternoon when the light was still strong. Then I slipped out of the cabin, moving fast down the path toward the main road. Every sound in the woods made me flinch. I kept looking over my shoulder, certain I would see someone following. Several times I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I stopped, there was nothing. Still, I knew I was being watched. The feeling of eyes on me was so strong it made my skin crawl. I walked for hours, my legs aching, my pack dragging me down. I didn't dare rest long. As the sun started to sink, I still hadn't reached the main road. The forest felt endless. My chest grew tight with panic. I thought about turning back, but I couldn't make myself do it. Finally, near dusk, I broke through to a gravel road. Relief washed over me so strong I nearly collapsed. I dropped my pack, gasping for air, my whole body trembling. But the relief didn't last. When I looked down the road, I drove up the long gravel road with the sound of the rocks crunching under my tires. The road twisted through tall pine trees that leaned in over the path like they wanted to block the way. The air was heavy with the smell of sap and dirt, and as I rolled down the window, I felt the cool bite of mountain air on my face. I had rented the cabin for a week to be alone, to get away from noise, from people, from the constant hum of the city. It looked like the perfect place. The cabin was small and wooden, tucked into the trees, with a small porch that faced a clearing. There was no one around for miles. When I pulled up, I sat in the car for a while, engine off, just looking at it. The roof was dark from years of rain. The wood looked old but strong. A single chimney poked out, and I could already imagine smoke rising from it at night. There was an old shed a few yards away, leaning slightly to the side, its door hanging crooked. Behind everything stretched the forest, thick and endless. I carried my bags inside. The air was stale, like it hadn't been opened in months. Dust hung in the light that cut through the single front window. The inside was simple, just one big room with a kitchen along one wall, a small table, a couch, and a bed pushed into the corner. A wood stove sat against the wall with a pile of chopped logs stacked beside it. The bathroom was small, with a toilet and sink, and there was no shower, only a metal basin for washing. It was what I had expected. I wanted simple. I wanted quiet. The first day went easy. I unpacked, cleaned a little, and stacked my food on the shelves. I sat on the porch as the sun dropped behind the trees. The quiet was thick. No cars, no voices, no sirens. Only the sound of wind moving through the trees and the distant call of birds. When night came, it was darker than anything I was used to. The stars were sharp, and the sky looked bigger than it ever did back home. I lit a small fire inside, ate a can of beans with bread, and lay on the bed listening to the crackle of the flames. I slept light that night, waking at small noises. The roof creaked, the wood popped. Once I thought I heard something outside, a snap like a branch breaking, but when I held my breath, the forest went silent again. I told myself it was just animals, deer, maybe raccoons. I fell back asleep. The next morning, I went for a walk down the road. My boots kicked at loose stones as I went, and my breath made clouds in the cold air. The trees seemed to go on forever. There were no other cabins, no houses, nothing but woods and the dirt road that wound through them. After about a mile, I turned back. I had the uneasy feeling that if I went too far, I might not find my way again. That evening, I cut firewood. The sound of the axe echoed sharp through the trees. Each swing sent chips of wood flying, and sweat ran down my back even though the air was cool. I made a good pile by the door, enough to last a few days. I was proud of it, the kind of work that left my muscles sore but gave me something solid to look at. The second night, I woke again to a noise outside. This time, it was not just a branch. It sounded like footsteps, slow and heavy, moving across the porch. My chest tightened, and I lay frozen on the bed. I stared at the ceiling, heart hammering so hard I thought it would shake the mattress. The steps went from one side of the porch to the other, then stopped. The silence that followed felt louder than the noise. I waited, hardly breathing, until finally I forced myself to sit up. I strained my ears, but the sound didn't return. I stayed awake for hours after that, staring at the dark window. I told myself again it could have been an animal, a bear maybe, or a large deer, but I had heard the boards of the porch bend under weight. That was not the sound of hooves. That was the sound of feet. When morning came, I went outside. The grass in front of the porch was wet with dew, and my boots sank into the ground as I stepped off. I looked carefully at the dirt around the porch, but it was hard to tell. There were marks, but they could have been anything, shadows, old prints, or nothing at all. The wood of the porch didn't show clear signs either, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. The day dragged. I tried to distract myself by hiking a little into the woods behind the cabin. The air was damp, and the forest floor was soft with pine needles. I could hear squirrels rustling through the underbrush and the occasional bird flapping overhead. But I couldn't shake the thought that someone could be out there too, watching me between the trees. I didn't go far. That night, I locked the door and stacked 2 chairs against it. I closed the curtains tight and kept the fire burning low. The shadows flicked across the walls as the flames shifted, and every small sound made me sit up. Around midnight, I heard it again. Not on the porch this time, but near the shed. A scrape, then a thump, like something moving against the old wood. I lay stiff on the bed, staring toward the sound. The shed was only about 20 yards away. If someone was there, they were close. I wanted to look out the window, but the thought of pulling the curtain and seeing someone standing there froze me in place. After what felt like forever, the noise stopped. The night went still again. When the sun came up, I forced myself to walk to the shed. The door was half open, swinging slightly. I remembered clearly that it had been closed. Inside, the air smelled like damp rot. Old tools leaned against the wall, rusted saws, a hammer, and a broken shovel. A stack of crates sat in the corner. Nothing looked touched, but the open door was enough to make my stomach turn. The days went slower after that. I was always on edge. Every time the wind shook the trees, I felt a prickle on the back of my neck. I checked the door and windows again and again, making sure they were locked. I stopped going for walks. I barely stepped off the porch. I sat most of the day inside, listening, waiting. On the fourth night, I woke to the sound of the doorknob turning. It was soft, slow, like someone trying not to make noise. I held my breath, every muscle stiff. The chairs against the door rattled gently as the knob twisted. Then it stopped. Silence. My chest burned as I tried not to breathe too loud. Minutes passed, long and heavy. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, moving away from the door, fading into the forest. I couldn't sleep after that. I sat by the fire with my back to the wall, an axe across my lap. I stared at the door until dawn. In the morning, I found clear footprints in the dirt outside the porch. Not animal prints. Human. Bare feet, wide and dirty, pressed deep into the soft ground. They led from the trees to the door and then back into the woods. My stomach twisted when I saw them. Someone had been here. Someone had tried to come in. The rest of the day, I tried to think of what to do. There was no phone signal. The nearest town was an hour away. I didn't want to leave everything and walk down that long dirt road with someone out there watching. I decided to stay until the week ended, then drive out. I kept the axe with me at all times. That night was the worst. I barely let the fire die, afraid of the dark. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the shed again. This time louder. A bang. Then another, like fists against the wood. I gripped the axe and stared at the door, my whole body shaking. The banging stopped. Then, slow, steady steps crunched through the dirt toward the cabin. They reached the porch. The boards creaked under the weight. The doorknob rattled hard. The chairs against the door shook. I wanted to shout, to scare them off, but my throat locked up. I held the axe tighter, waiting. After a long moment, the shaking stopped. The footsteps moved along the side of the cabin. Then I heard scratching at the wall, like nails dragging over wood. It circled the cabin, slow, steady, until finally it faded back toward the trees. I didn't move until the sun lit the window. When morning came, I packed everything fast. I shoved my bags into the car and loaded the axe on the seat beside me. I didn't care about finishing the week. I needed to leave. The footprints in the dirt were everywhere now, circling the cabin, leading to the shed, the porch, the windows. I got into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove down the gravel road, my hands tight on the wheel, I looked once into the rearview mirror. The cabin sat small and quiet in the clearing, smoke from last night's fire still faint in the air. At the edge of the trees, I thought I saw something move, a figure tall and thin, stepping back into the shadows. Then it was gone. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop until the trees thinned and the road opened to the highway. Only then did I breathe again. I never went back to that cabin. I told myself it was just someone passing through the woods, some drifter living out there, curious about me. But the bare footprints, the way they circled, the way they came back night after night, I knew it was more than curiosity. They had been waiting, watching, and if I had stayed one more night, if I had ignored the fear, If I hadn't left when I did, I don't think I would have made it out. I had been looking forward to a few quiet days away from everything. Life had been getting overwhelming back in the city, and I thought the best way to reset was to isolate myself in a small cabin far out in the woods. I had rented one that sat alone at the edge of a large forest, about an hour's drive from the nearest small town. The pictures online made it look peaceful, with a simple wooden frame, a small porch, and a narrow gravel driveway leading up from an unmarked dirt road. I packed my truck with food, water, warm clothes, and a few tools just in case, because I knew how risky it could be being alone that far out. My plan was simple: cook, read, sleep, and enjoy the silence. The drive was long and winding. The paved road ended at a gas station, and from there the rest was dirt and gravel, with tall trees on both sides and almost no signs of people. By the time I reached the driveway, the sun was low and the trees cast long shadows across the clearing. The cabin stood just as it had looked in the photos, plain but sturdy. A metal chimney stuck out of the roof, a small shed sat off to the side, and there was a woodpile stacked neatly against the outer wall. When I stepped inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood and dust, the way most cabins do when no one has stayed in them for a while. The layout was simple: one main room with a wood stove, a couch, a table with 2 chairs, and a small kitchen area with a propane stove and sink. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom. There was no electricity except for a small generator outside that I could run if I needed light. The water came from a tank system, and there was a small pump out back to refill it if needed. I spent the first evening settling in. I brought in my bags, stacked my food neatly in the small shelves, and lit a fire in the wood stove. The sound of the fire popping and crackling felt comforting, and outside the trees swayed slowly in the cold evening wind. It was quiet enough that I could hear the faint groan of the trees shifting. After making a simple meal, I sat on the couch and let the silence wash over me. That first night passed without trouble. I woke up a few times, not used to the total darkness outside, but nothing felt wrong. The forest was silent except for an occasional rustle, probably from deer moving through the undergrowth. The next morning, I took a short walk around the clearing. The cabin sat at the end of the gravel driveway that branched off a longer dirt road. The road stretched into the forest in both directions. Though I hadn't seen another house or cabin anywhere near, I noticed the trees were thick and tall, blocking much of the sky, and the air felt heavy and still. I returned inside, made breakfast, and planned to spend the day reading. It was during the afternoon that I first noticed something strange. While sitting by the window with a book, I saw faint tire tracks on the gravel driveway, just past the point where my truck was parked. They hadn't been there when I arrived. The dirt and gravel were loose, so tire marks showed up clearly, and I was sure mine stopped where I had parked. These tracks continued beyond that point, curving around the cabin as if another vehicle had driven up, turned near the shed, and then left. At first I thought maybe the owner had come by to check on something, but there had been no sound of a vehicle, and the cabin had been locked when I arrived. The tracks looked fresh, too, not covered by leaves or rain. I stepped outside and followed them slowly. They went around the cabin, stopped near the shed, and then looped back down the driveway. There were no footprints that I could see, but the ground was hard in most places. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself it could have been from before I arrived, and maybe I just hadn't noticed. But the thought stuck in my head the rest of the day. That night, I had a harder time sleeping. The fire had gone out, and the cabin grew cold and silent. I lay awake in bed, listening to the faint creaks of the building as it cooled. Around midnight, I thought I heard a sound outside, like a branch snapping, followed by the crunch of gravel. I froze in place, straining my ears. For a long moment, there was nothing, and I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But then I heard it again, a soft crunch, as if someone was stepping slowly along the driveway. I stayed still for what felt like an hour, until finally the sound stopped. My heart was beating hard in my chest. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back to sleep. In the morning, I went outside to check. The driveway showed new footprints. They were faint, but definitely there, pressed into the gravel and dirt near where my truck was parked. They led off into the woods and disappeared into the trees. They weren't mine. I had only walked near the shed the day before, not around the truck. The realization made my stomach drop. Someone had been walking around the cabin in the night. I tried to reason with myself again. Maybe a hunter had wandered through. Maybe someone had gotten lost and turned back. But the footprints had circled close to the cabin, near the truck, not in a straight line as if passing by. The rest of that day, I couldn't relax. Every time I looked out the window, I half expected to see someone standing at the tree line. I kept the fire going even during the day, just to feel like there was some life inside the cabin. That night was worse. I went to bed early, hoping sleep would come quickly, but I woke up again to noises. This time it was clearer. A slow scraping sound near the porch, followed by another crunch on the gravel. I held my breath, lying completely still in the dark. The sound shifted to the side of the cabin, faint but steady. Someone was out there again. I thought about turning on the generator to flood the cabin with light, but I was afraid that if someone was trying to stay hidden, showing them where I was would make things worse. I gripped the heavy flashlight I had by the bed and waited. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped again. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. More footprints. This time they were clearer, right near the porch steps. Whoever it was had come up close enough to stand just outside the door. My skin crawled at the thought that someone had been only a few feet from where I was lying inside. I knew I should leave, but the thought of driving down that long dirt road made me uneasy. If someone had been watching the cabin, they could be waiting along the road. My truck wasn't fast, and the road was narrow. I told myself I'd wait one more night, and if anything happened again, I'd leave at first light. That day dragged on endlessly. I kept checking the windows, circling the cabin, looking for movement in the trees. The forest was quiet, too quiet, with no birdsong. By evening, I had built the fire higher than usual, but as darkness settled, the unease grew heavier. That night, I barely slept at all. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. There was the faint metallic rattle of the shed door being pulled. The shed was old, with a rusty latch, and the sound was unmistakable. My chest tightened as I listened. The rattling stopped, followed by silence, then the crunch of slow footsteps moving back toward the cabin. I waited, gripping the flashlight, my hands sweating. The footsteps reached the porch. The boards creaked under the weight. Someone was standing on the porch. For minutes, nothing else happened. Then, a slow dragging sound moved across the porch floor, like a hand or object sliding across the wood. Couldn't breathe. Finally, after what felt like forever, the sound stopped. Silence followed, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves outside. At first light, I packed everything into the truck. I didn't care anymore if it was paranoia or if someone really was out there. The footprints, the shed door, the porch, I couldn't ignore it. I started the engine and drove down the dirt road as fast as I could manage without sliding off. When I reached the main road, I finally looked back. The cabin sat quiet in the clearing, smoke still drifting from the chimney. Nothing moved, but the feeling that I was being watched stayed with me until I reached the small town. I never went back to that cabin. Later, when I checked the rental listing online, it had been taken down. No explanation, no details, just gone. The memory of those nights has never left me. The thought that someone had walked around the cabin, had stood on the porch just outside the door, while I lay frozen inside, still makes my skin crawl. I'll never know who it was or what they wanted, but I know for certain someone was there, and if I hadn't left when I did, I might never have left at all. I had decided to spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the woods. I wanted to disconnect from everything for a while. No phone calls, no work, no distractions, just quiet time and fresh air. The cabin was small but decent, made of old wood, with a tin roof and a stone chimney. It sat at the edge of a clearing with tall trees all around. The place was about 10 miles from the nearest town, and the dirt road leading up to it was rough and narrow. I had driven up in my old truck and brought enough food, water, and supplies to last me the entire week. My plan was simple: rest, cook simple meals, walk the trails, and sleep early each night. The first day felt peaceful. I unloaded the truck, stacked firewood, swept out the cabin, and checked that everything worked. The water pump outside was slow but steady. The old propane stove lit fine, and the kerosene lamps gave off enough light. Inside, the cabin had one bedroom with a thin mattress on a wooden frame, a small kitchen corner, and a living space with 2 chairs and a table. The windows had old shutters that could be latched from the inside. The back door had a rusty lock, and the front door had a heavy bolt. It was simple but more than enough for me. The first 2 days passed without trouble. I spent time sitting outside on the porch, reading a little, writing in my notebook, and walking the trails near the cabin. The woods felt thick and quiet, but not unsettling at first. The nights were colder than I expected, and the silence pressed in once the sun went down. I noticed how every little sound carried farther in the dark. An owl calling, branches snapping, the wind in the leaves. I reminded myself this was normal for the forest, that I simply wasn't used to it. By the 3rd night, I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't anything big at first. I just noticed small changes that caught my attention. That night, when I went to lock the front door, I saw faint scuff marks near the bottom of it, like something had scraped against the wood. They weren't there before, or at least I hadn't noticed them. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I had dragged something past it while carrying supplies. But later that same night, I heard a sound outside, like gravel being shifted slowly. I froze in bed, holding my breath, waiting. After a while, it stopped, and I told myself it was just an animal wandering through. The 4th day, I walked deeper into the trees than usual. About half a mile out, I came across an old path I hadn't noticed before. It was narrow and partly overgrown, but I followed it for curiosity. It led down a slope and into a small hollow. At the bottom of it, I found a patch of disturbed ground. It looked like something had been dug up or maybe buried. The dirt was uneven and loose, not the way natural ground should look. I stood there staring at it for a long time, feeling uncomfortable. It didn't make sense for anyone to dig there, not this deep in the woods. No markers, no signs, just a rough patch of earth. I backed away and decided not to mention it to myself again. That night was harder. As I sat by the lamp, I kept hearing faint cracks in the woods, like footsteps shifting slowly, stopping, starting again. The sound came from different directions, not steady, but enough to make me stop what I was doing and listen. I told myself it was deer moving around, maybe raccoons or something, but it didn't sound like the scattered noise of animals. It sounded more deliberate, heavier, with pauses between steps. I shut the shutters, bolted the doors, and sat with my back to the wall until I finally forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I found something strange near the porch. In the damp dirt right below the steps were 2 deep prints. They weren't boot tracks exactly, but they weren't shaped like any animal print I recognized either. They were wide, uneven, and sunk deeper at the front, like whoever or whatever made them had leaned their weight forward. The ground around them was scuffed, as if something had lingered there for a while. My chest felt tight looking at them. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe hunters sometimes came through here. Maybe some old-timer knew about this place. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I stayed inside more that day, listening, checking the windows often. As evening came, I noticed how quiet the woods felt. No birds, no wind, just stillness. I set a lantern near the window and sat in the dark corner of the room to watch. Around midnight, I saw movement through a gap in the shutters. Something passed between the trees at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't close enough to see clearly, just a dark shape that moved slowly, stopping now and then. I held my breath until it faded back into the trees. The following morning, I checked outside again. More prints circled the cabin, shallow in some places, deeper in others. They weren't in a straight line, more like pacing around, stopping here and there. The ground near the back door had marks like someone had pressed against it. The rusty lock was scratched. That was when the weight of it hit me. Someone had been walking around the cabin at night, trying the doors, circling, waiting. I spent that whole day on edge. I carried a hatchet with me everywhere inside the cabin. I kept the doors bolted even in daylight. Every sound from the woods made me flinch. By the time darkness came, my hands were shaking lighting the lamp. I thought about running to the truck, but the idea of driving the long dirt road at night with someone possibly out there felt worse. So I stayed inside, heart racing, waiting for the night to end. That night was the worst. I hardly moved from my chair, just sat in silence listening. Around midnight, the sounds started again. Slow steps in the dirt, then a scrape along the wall. I could hear it clearly, fingers or something dragging lightly across the wooden boards. Then the soft thump of weight on the porch steps. The boards creaked under it. I gripped the hatchet so hard my knuckles ached. For what felt like hours, the sounds moved around the cabin. Sometimes close to the windows, sometimes on the porch, sometimes in the dirt just beyond. Each time I thought it was gone, another sound came. My skin crawled with the thought of someone standing inches away from me, just separated by thin wood and glass. At some point deep in the night, the sound shifted to the back of the cabin. Then I heard the faint clink of metal on metal, the rusty lock on the back door being worked. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I stared at the door, waiting, knowing there was nothing else I could do. The lock held, but the sound went on for a long time, scraping and pulling. Finally it stopped, and the silence that followed felt even worse. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I was done. I packed fast, shoving everything into bags without care. I didn't eat, didn't wash, just kept looking out the windows as I stuffed things into the truck. The ground outside was a mess of tracks, circling, stopping, pacing. The lock on the back door was twisted and bent, nearly broken through. I couldn't take it anymore. I started the truck and drove down that rough road as fast as I could, heart hammering every time the trees seemed to shift at the edges of my vision. When I finally reached the main road, I didn't stop until I was back in town. I found a cheap motel and stayed there the rest of the night, still shaking, listening to every sound through the thin walls. I didn't go back to the cabin. The supplies, the food, everything I left behind didn't matter. I just wanted to be away from that place. The experience stayed with me long after. I kept replaying it in my mind. Those prints in the dirt, the sound of the lock, the weight on the porch steps. Whoever it was, they never showed themselves fully, never tried to speak, never rushed. They just circled, tested, and waited. That's what made it worse. It wasn't an accident, it wasn't some animal or lost hiker. It was deliberate. Someone out there knew I was alone in that cabin, and they wanted to get in. In the end, I understood the danger could have been worse than anything I imagined. If the locks had failed, if I had frozen at the wrong moment, I might not have made it out. I had thought I was going out there for peace and quiet, but instead I had walked straight into someone else's hunting ground, and I barely escaped. That was the last time I ever went alone to a cabin in the woods.